This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Pinewood, North Carolina, was the kind of town where the wind had a voice. It whispered through the towering pines, the crumbling stone fences, the cracked sidewalks, echoing old secrets long buried beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect community. The town hadn't changed in decades, and those who lived there prided themselves on its unwavering tranquility. Pinewood was a place where nothing bad ever happened, or so the townsfolk liked to think. It sat nestled against the edge of the Appalachian foothills, the dense forest surrounding it like a dark veil, hiding it from the outside world. The houses were small but well kept, their lawns manicured to the point of obsession, each one a perfect replica of its neighbor. The roads were empty most of the time, save for the occasional rusted truck or the clatter of a bicycle against the pavement. At night, the streets were quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made it impossible to shake the sense that something was wrong, though nobody could ever put their finger on it. In Pinewood, it was easy to believe that nothing could disturb the stillness, the uniformity. Even the people who lived there had a certain hollow quality to them, like actors in a play who'd long forgotten their lines, their movements stiff and rehearsed. They smiled at each other with practiced ease, exchanged pleasantries at the grocery store. The town had always been this way, conservative, insular, a place where newcomers were viewed with suspicion, where differences were ignored, and where everyone had learned to keep their heads down. It was a town where the worst you could expect was a minor traffic accident, or a small-town scandal that would eventually fade into the past. But then, one day, 3 girls arrived. Their names were Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia. They were not from Pinewood. They didn't belong here. The first time the town saw them, it was as though the air had thickened. They were unlike anyone the townspeople had ever known. Too dark, too loud, too foreign. Their clothes were always too extravagant for a town like this, their hair braided in intricate patterns that seemed to belong to a place far away. Their voices tinged with accents that carried hints of places no one in Pinewood had ever visited. They were outcasts, even before anyone had the chance to judge them. At first, the townspeople didn't know what to make of them. They were girls who didn't fit in, and that was a dangerous thing in a town like Pinewood. People talked. Not in the open, of course, but behind closed doors, in hushed tones and sidelong glances. There were rumors, mostly. People whispered about how Jasmine's father was in jail for reasons no one cared to understand, how Zuri's life was a chain of foster homes and broken promises, how Talia's mother had died under mysterious circumstances when she was just a child. No one knew the truth, but the stories were more than enough to stain their reputations in the eyes of the town. Jasmine had dark eyes that gleamed with something unsettling, something like hunger, but no one could name it. She moved through the halls of Pinewood High like a shadow, silent, calculating. Her smile was rare, and when it did appear, it was brief and strange, as though it was more of a grimace than an expression of joy. The girls she passed in the halls avoided her gaze, though they didn't know why. Zuri, with her bright, defiant eyes and a crooked smirk that never quite seemed to reach her face, was more outwardly rebellious. She'd wear torn jackets and black lipstick, skipping class with a swagger that made teachers uncomfortable. She was never afraid to speak her mind, though no one had ever asked for her opinion. Talia, the youngest of the 3, was the quietest. She never spoke unless she had to, her gaze far away, as if she was always thinking of something else. People said she had the air of a girl who had seen things no one should have to see. In the beginning, they kept to themselves. They didn't seek out friends, and no one sought them out. Pinewood had a way of isolating those who didn't fit in. The cliques were tight, the social order rigid. But the girls were different. They didn't seem to care. They sat together at lunch, talking in low voices, their words always soft and private. No one ever understood them, not really, but that didn't matter to the girls. They had their own world, a secret world that no one else could enter, and they were content to leave it that way. As days bled into weeks and weeks bled into months, Pinewood started to change, though no one could point to the moment it began. It was subtle at first, small things. A light left on all night in an abandoned house. A neighbor's cat gone missing, its collar found near the woods. An unsettling sense that someone, somewhere, was watching you. At first, people shrugged it off. They were just coincidences, nothing more. But as the strange occurrences piled up, the town began to feel different. The air had an edge to it now, sharp and electric, like the calm before a storm. No one knew it yet, but this was the beginning of the end. Pinewood's facade of peace was about to crack open, and the darkness lurking beneath would come spilling out in ways no one could have imagined. It wasn't until the first death that the town realized something was wrong. The body was found in the woods behind the elementary school, a place that had always been sacred and untouched. The victim was an older man, a local handyman who was known for his kindness, an innocent soul in the eyes of the townspeople. His death was brutal, though, and the way his body was left behind, discarded like garbage, felt wrong. It wasn't just the violence of the act. It was the way it was done, the coldness, the precision. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was something more calculated, more deliberate. The police investigated, but there were no leads, no suspects, no clues. The town continued to move forward, pretending that it hadn't noticed the darkness creeping in. But the unease lingered, clinging to Pinewood like the smell of something rotting just out of sight. The girls? They seemed unaffected. They went about their lives as though nothing had changed. They still sat together at lunch, still walked the halls with their heads held high, still moved through the town like ghosts. No one could understand how they could be so indifferent, how they could live in the midst of all this horror and remain so calm. But it wasn't until later that the town would realize the truth. The girls weren't unaffected by the death. They were the ones who had caused it. Pinewood had always believed it was safe. It had always prided itself on its simplicity, its quiet existence. But now, that silence began to feel like a trap, and the cracks in the facade were starting to show. And as the town slept, unaware of the storm building just beyond its borders, the girls waited. They were ready to make their mark. Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia had never known anything that resembled a normal childhood. They were bound together by a darkness far deeper than the shadow of the town they had come to inhabit. The town of Pinewood, for all its pristine lawns and quiet streets, was nothing more than a stage, a backdrop for the haunting stories of their lives. Their histories, like the thorns of a twisted vine, had woven them together in ways no one could understand, least of all the people who lived in the town. They were three girls, three souls broken by the world long before they arrived in Pinewood, each carrying the weight of a past that would never let them go. Jasmine was the oldest, a girl with a broken smile and eyes too old for her years. She had been born into a home where love was a foreign concept, a place where violence had always lingered just behind the door. Her father, a man whose temper was as volatile as a thunderstorm, had never known how to love. He had tried, at least in his own twisted way, but his love was the kind that bruised, that scarred, that twisted innocence into something dark. Jasmine's mother, an empty shell of a woman, had never stood up to him. She had been swallowed whole by the same darkness, her eyes distant and hollow, as if she had long since given up on any hope of escape. The house was always cold, even in the summer, and Jasmine had learned early on that silence was the safest way to survive. By the time she was 10, she had already learned how to hide, how to stay out of the way. When her father's anger flared, she would retreat into the dark corners of the house, burying herself in the quiet. There, in the silence, she would close her eyes and imagine another life, one far away from the constant screaming, the shattering of glass, the broken furniture. Her world was one of whispers and shadows, a place where fear had taken root deep within her, growing stronger with every passing day. It wasn't until she was 13 that the violence escalated. Her father's rage, once a fleeting storm, became a constant, and when it came, it was brutal. The worst of it came one cold winter night when Jasmine's father lost control entirely. He had been drinking, too much as always, and her mother had done nothing to stop it. Jasmine had been forced to watch as her father tore into her mother, the sounds of the blows reverberating through the house like gunshots. The horror of it was too much to bear, but there was nothing she could do. She was just a child trapped in a nightmare of her father's making. Her tribe was made to visit the house later that afternoon to reach out to Jasmine. That night, her mother's body lay still, lifeless, blood staining the carpet. Jasmine was left alone, the weight of the violence crashing down on her. And in that moment, she swore that she would never let anyone hurt her again. Not the way her father had hurt her, not the way he had hurt her mother. But even as the years passed and her life moved forward, the scars remained, both the ones visible and those hidden deep within her. Zuri, the second girl, had a past that was no less horrific, though it was different in its own way. Zuri had been born into a system that was supposed to protect her, but it had failed her at every turn. Her earliest memories were of cold foster homes and empty faces. She had been shuffled from one house to another, a child without roots, a girl who had learned not to get too attached, because she was always one step away from being discarded. Each foster home was a new nightmare, filled with new strangers, new rules, and new betrayals. Zuri had learned quickly that affection was nothing more than a fleeting illusion, given freely only to be ripped away in the blink of an eye. She had learned how to survive on her own, how to make herself small when she needed to, how to keep her head down and keep moving. There were moments, small glimpses of love that Zuri would cling to for a while, only to have them ripped away again. In one home, she had found comfort in a woman who promised her safety, a woman who, for a short time, made her believe in the possibility of home. But the woman's kindness had been conditional, extremely conditional. Zuri's rebellious streak, her refusal to be controlled, had been too much for the woman to handle. Her courtesy had been too much for the woman to handle. One night, when Zuri had made a mistake, nothing more than a minor infraction, she had been locked in the basement for hours, the darkness suffocating her, the silence louder than any punishment. It was in that basement, in that endless black, that Zuri had begun to understand that love was not real, and the world was a place where power was all that mattered. And so, she learned to be hard, to be cold, to cut people out of her life before they could hurt her. But that didn't stop the rage from building inside her, the need to lash out, to destroy. By the time she was 16, Zuri had grown accustomed to anger, to the feeling of violence simmering beneath her skin. It became a companion, a thing she could never shake. She didn't know where the rage came from. It was just there, in every breath she took. She had learned to use it, to channel it, to hide it behind her defiant smile and the reckless bravado that kept everyone at a distance. But when the time came, when she finally found herself with the other two girls, she knew that her anger would no longer be something to hide. It would be something to embrace. Talia, the youngest of them, had always been different. Talia's story was the most enigmatic of them all, wrapped in mystery and unspoken horrors. She had been born into a life of privilege, or so it seemed at first. Her mother had been a beautiful woman, well-liked in their small town, married to a man with money and influence. Talia had been the perfect child, quiet, obedient, loved by all. But nothing in her life had been what it seemed. Her mother's love had always felt distant, conditional, as though Talia was just another object to be admired, not a person to be understood. Her father, a man who wore his power like a crown, had no patience for a daughter who refused to play by the rules. He had been a cruel man, a man who treated his family like an extension of his wealth, a thing to be controlled. But the true horror of Talia's life came one evening when she was just 11. Her mother, a woman who had long since lost any semblance of strength, had died under mysterious circumstances. The doctors had said it was an accident, that her mother's heart had failed. But Talia had known better. Her mother had been poisoned. She had been killed slowly, deliberately, by someone she trusted. Talia had discovered the truth too late. Her mother's face, pale and ashen, had shown the signs of the poisoning long before anyone else noticed. But by the time the truth came to light, her mother was already gone. The pain of losing her mother was unbearable, but the cruelty of the death was worse. Talia's father, stone-faced and unemotional, had barely acknowledged the loss, as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his life. The realization that her mother had been murdered, that no one had cared enough to protect her, broke something inside Talia. It twisted her mind, filling her with a thirst for revenge, a need to make those who had wronged her feel the same pain she had felt. And so, she became a ghost, moving through the world with cold eyes, never speaking of the horrors she had witnessed. Her mind became a maze of broken thoughts, of unanswered questions, of memories too painful to relive. She had learned to bury her emotions, to pretend they didn't exist, but they were there, always there, like a wound that never healed. Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia had all suffered in different ways, but their pain had fused them together. They had found each other in the darkest of places, and in each other they found a sense of belonging they had never known before. They were three girls, each broken in her own way, each searching for something they could never have: peace, love, or even just a semblance of safety. But what they found, in the end, was something much darker. They found each other's rage, each other's thirst for vengeance, and together they made a promise. No one would ever hurt them again. And so, their path was set. The town of Pinewood had no idea what was coming. The quiet that had once been Pinewood's defining characteristic was starting to feel like a lie. Beneath the manicured lawns and the gentle sway of the trees, something was festering. The town's flaws had always been hidden under a veneer of politeness, of conformity, but as time passed, they began to seep through the cracks. For years, Pinewood had prided itself on being a sanctuary, a place where no one had to question the norms, where everything was as it should be. But there were wounds in the town that no one wanted to acknowledge, wounds that were too deep to ignore any longer. It was the beginning of the summer when it all came crashing down, a time when the oppressive heat was enough to make the air feel thick, almost suffocating. The girls, Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia, had been drifting through the days like ghosts, unnoticed by most of the town, keeping to their own world, a world no one else could touch. They had become accustomed to being invisible, to living in the margins of Pinewood's existence. But something was changing. The town had begun to take notice of them, and that attention, while subtle at first, was enough to set something in motion. The first spark came in the form of an event that should have been insignificant, an incident that most people would have forgotten by the end of the day. It began with a confrontation between one of their classmates, a boy named Mason, and a local police officer who had long been a fixture of Pinewood's small community. Officer Garrett was well liked in the town, his clean-cut appearance and affable smile making him a familiar face at school functions and neighborhood block parties. He was a symbol of the town's unshakable sense of order. But the reality was far different from the image he projected. Mason, who had always been a bit of an outsider in Pinewood, awkward, quiet, prone to fits of anger, had crossed paths with Officer Garrett one evening as he was walking home from the local convenience store. Mason had been carrying a bag of chips and a soda, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his oversized hoodie, his head down, as if he was trying to disappear into the pavement. He wasn't doing anything wrong, not really, but Officer Garrett had stopped him, asking him to step aside. It wasn't the first time Mason had been stopped by the police, but something about this encounter felt different. Officer Garrett's tone was more commanding, more aggressive, like a predator toying with its prey. The situation escalated quickly. Garrett, who had never been one to tolerate defiance, began questioning Mason's motives, accusing him of loitering, of looking suspicious. The truth was that Mason didn't fit the town's narrow idea of what a good kid should look like. He was quiet, yes, but he had dark skin and wore clothes that didn't belong to the mainstream. His style was eclectic, punk-inspired, a mix of chains and ripped denim that made the older residents nervous. The whispers had started long before the confrontation. Troublemaker, delinquent, bad influence. It didn't matter that Mason wasn't doing anything wrong. It didn't matter that he had never committed a crime. To Officer Garrett, he was an easy target, someone who could be controlled with a few well-chosen words. But Mason wasn't one to back down. Not anymore. The encounter quickly turned hostile, with Garrett escalating his questioning, becoming more accusatory, more insistent. Mason refused to be intimidated, his anger flaring in response to Garrett's condescension. The situation grew heated, and by the time the argument had reached its peak, it was no longer just about a simple stop. It had become about power, about control, about the unspoken assumptions that ran through the veins of Pinewood's residents. The assumptions that said certain people belonged and certain people didn't. Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia had been nearby when the confrontation began, standing on the corner of Maple and Fourth, watching the scene unfold from a distance. At first, they had paid little attention. They were used to the friction that existed between the town's white, conservative population and those who didn't fit the mold. But as the argument continued, something shifted within them. Something primal. Something that had been buried for so long, they could feel the injustice in the air, the weight of it pressing down on their chests. They could see the way Garrett's eyes narrowed as he spoke to Mason, the way his voice dropped lower, more threatening, the way he assumed his authority was something Mason should simply obey, something that should be accepted without question. Zuri's fists clenched at her sides. Jasmine's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and fury. Talia stood there, silent, her gaze distant, but there was something in her eyes, something dark that seemed to pierce through the tent. They had seen it before, the way people like them were treated, the way they were viewed through a lens of suspicion, of fear. It wasn't just about Mason. It was about them too. About everything they had endured, everything they had been forced to survive. And in that moment, it felt like the entire town was complicit in the violence that had shaped their lives. The quiet prejudice that ran deep in the soil of Pinewood. When Garrett's hand moved toward his belt, when his fingers grazed the gun holstered there, it was the tipping point. For the first time, the girls felt a sense of power stir within them, a feeling they hadn't known in years. This was their moment. The moment when the world that had always crushed them beneath its boot would finally be shown for what it was. But it was too late. Before Garrett could make a move, the situation erupted into chaos. A neighbor, an older woman with a sharp tongue and a penchant for gossip, had stepped outside just in time to witness the confrontation. She had seen the girls standing there, watching, and had made an assumption. One that would change everything. She shouted something about troublemakers and the company they keep, her voice thick with the weight of years of unspoken racism. It was the final spark, the one that ignited the fire that would consume the town. Mason, now fully enraged, had shouted back, his words filled with anger, frustration, and desperation. "What the hell is wrong with this town?" he had yelled. "You people act like I'm a criminal just because of the way I look." Officer Garrett had responded with force, shoving Mason to the ground, his boots scraping against the pavement as he tried to hold him down. The scene had become violent in an instant. The older woman had run back inside, slamming the door behind her, the sound of it echoing through the still air. The girls watched from the corner, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding. For the first time, they felt something stir within them, a need to take control of the situation, to stand up and make a statement that would not be ignored. Jasmine had moved first, stepping out from the shadows, her footsteps deliberate, steady. Zuri followed, her fists clenched, her eyes alight with the same fire. Talia lingered for a moment, as if waiting for something, before she too moved toward the confrontation, her presence haunting, like a shadow on the edge of the world. It wasn't the shouting, nor the scuffle, nor the presence of the police that had set the spark. It was something deeper, a recognition, a shared understanding that the power was shifting, that the ground was moving beneath their feet. Pinewood, in all its quiet pride, had become a powder keg, and the girls were the fuse. It was not the first time the town had felt the tremors of unrest. It was not the first time the old wounds had been pulled open, nor the first time the ghosts of Pinewood's past had risen to haunt it. But it was the moment when Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia realized that they could be more than victims of circumstance. They could be something else entirely. It could be the spark that burned it all down. That evening, as the sky bled red with the setting sun, Pinewood was forever changed. The quiet town would never return to the way it had been, and neither would the girls. The night the town of Pinewood would remember forever began like any other. The air was thick with humidity, the heat from the day lingering in the dark, making the stillness feel heavier, more suffocating. In the distance, a dog howled once, its cry echoing through the quiet streets before fading into nothing. The town's peace, the kind that had endured for years, seemed on the brink of being shattered. Though no one could have predicted how, or by whom, it had started with a whisper. a whisper in the shadows, barely audible, but full of intent. The girls, Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia, had been preparing for this moment for weeks. It was no longer a question of if they would act, but when. And that night, the night that seemed so ordinary to everyone else, became the night they decided to finally unleash the nightmare that had been festering within them. The events of that evening would carve a mark into the town's history so deep that no one would ever be able to erase it. It began at dusk, when the last rays of the sun had bled out of the sky, leaving behind a sickly purple hue that draped itself over Pinewood like a funeral shroud. The girls had already made their preparations, clothes as dark as the night, weapons hidden under their jackets, sharp, cold, and quiet. They moved like shadows, their steps soundless on the cracked pavement. Their eyes narrowed, their hearts beating in rhythm with the sickening excitement that pulsed through their veins. They were no longer just the girls the town had whispered about. They had become something else entirely. They had become an inevitable force, an executioner in the making. Each of them had a role to play, though none of them spoke the plan aloud. They didn't need to. The bond between them had been forged in pain, in silence, in shared blood and broken dreams. There was no need for words anymore. All that mattered was the task at hand. They knew the town well, perhaps better than anyone else. The sleepy streets, the quiet corners, the safe little neighborhoods. Pinewood was a town of secrets, and for once, the secrets would not remain hidden. The girls knew that fear could not be quelled with kindness, that the rage building inside them could not be extinguished by anything but blood. Their first stop was the home of Officer Garrett, the man who had threatened Mason, the man who had tried to assert his power over someone who no longer feared him. It was not an accident that they started here. Officer Garrett had been a symbol of everything that Pinewood had done wrong, everything that had led to their pain. His authority, his arrogance, his assumption that he could bend the world to his will had made him an easy target. And now, as the girls approached his house, the shadows of the trees stretching long and deep across the lawn, they felt the weight of that power slipping from his grasp. They had watched him for days, learning his routine, studying the moments when he was most vulnerable. He had always been a man who thrived in the daylight, but the dark would be his undoing. They moved swiftly, silently, like wolves circling their prey. Garrett's house sat at the edge of Pinewood, a two-story building with a white picket fence and neatly trimmed hedges. Everything about it screamed order, control, normalcy. It was the picture-perfect American dream, the kind of home everyone envied, but inside, the rot had already begun. The girls had already seen to that. As they approached the door, Talia slipped around the back of the house, blending into the darkness like a shadow. She moved with an eerie precision, the faint rustle of her steps unheard. Jasmine and Zuri, standing at the front, waited, watching for any sign of movement. Garrett had just returned home from his shift, the sounds of his footsteps heavy on the porch. They could hear him inside, the creak of the door, the low hum of the television. He was alone. The plan was simple, quick, efficient, no hesitation. The door swung open, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Garrett, oblivious, began to remove his shoes, his back to the door. But as he turned to hang up his jacket, he saw them. And for the briefest of moments, his face registered surprise. But surprise was not enough to save him. First blow came with a speed that was almost too fast to follow. Zuri was the one who struck, her hand gripping the heavy pipe, the metal meeting Garrett's skull with a sickening thud. His body crumpled in an instant, but not before a final, guttural gasp escaped his throat, as if his very soul were trying to escape the confines of his flesh. The sound was drowned out by the deafening silence that followed. The smell of blood filled the air, hot and metallic. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, like an elastic band pulled too far. Garrett's body collapsed to the floor in a heap, his hands still clutching the jacket he had worn earlier. His eyes, wide and empty, stared blankly at the ceiling, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no meaning here. Only execution. The girls didn't pause, they didn't linger. This was just the beginning. Next came the other houses, those of the prominent citizens. The ones who had never once questioned the system, who had never once stopped to ask why things were the way they were. The ones who had always turned a blind eye to the injustice, who had let their privilege blind them to the suffering that others endured. They had all played their part in keeping the town in chains, and tonight, the chains would be broken. It wasn't long before the town's streets began to stir, the air thick with the scent of impending doom. The girls had already crossed into the next neighborhood, where the houses stood side by side like silent witnesses, like victims waiting to be claimed. They struck quickly, without warning, moving through the houses like a dark storm. Doors were kicked open, and people who had never once thought they would feel fear in Pinewood were suddenly confronted with it in its most raw form. There was no mercy here, no forgiveness. There was only the cold, unflinching execution of a plan that had been years in the making. In one house, the walls were splattered with blood, the floors slick with it, as if the very essence of life had been drained from its inhabitants. In another, the bodies lay in twisted heaps, their faces frozen in expressions of horror, their eyes wide in disbelief. The girls moved from room to room, never pausing, never faltering. There was no panic in their movements, no second thoughts. Just the cold certainty that this was necessary, that this was the only way to rid the town of its rot. As the night wore on, the town of Pinewood began to suffocate under the weight of its own darkness. The sirens were slow to come, their wail distant, muffled by the trees and the buildings. By the time they did, it was already too late. The blood was already spilled, and the girls were already gone, leaving behind only carnage and the unmistakable echo of their presence. The town would never be the same. When the sun rose the next morning, it found Pinewood unrecognizable. The streets, once clean and quiet, were now stained with the aftermath of the execution. The houses, those proud symbols of suburban perfection, were now nothing more than graves. Empty, broken, haunted. The blood, dark and sticky on the ground, would remain as a permanent reminder of the night the town's sins were washed away. And the girls were gone, slipping back into the shadows, their names whispered with fear and reverence in the empty streets. But their mark would stay, embedded in the walls of the town, in the minds of those who had survived. Pinewood had been chosen. And now, nothing would ever be the same. The morning after the massacre, Pinewood was a town suffocating under an eerie, heavy silence. The sun, pale and unrelenting, rose over the scene of unimaginable horror, casting long, grotesque shadows over the streets that had once seemed so ordinary. The blood that stained the roads and the front steps of the houses was dark and sticky, a testament to the brutality that had unfolded under cover of darkness. The air was thick, like the town itself was holding its breath, unwilling to exhale the truth of what had happened. By the time the first responders arrived, half-dazed, their eyes wide and hollow from the shock of the night, the scene was beyond belief. The sirens had wailed all the way through Pinewood, a sound that seemed too sharp, too raw for such a quiet place. The coroner, when he finally arrived, was the first to speak the unspeakable. The brutality of the killings was unprecedented. Multiple victims. Blood everywhere, no sign of a struggle. It was as if something had risen from the depths of Pinewood's soul. Something dark, something that had been waiting for years to break free. The victims, 25 in total, had been chosen with a precision that unnerved even the most seasoned investigators. It wasn't random. It wasn't just violence for the sake of violence. The girls had known who they were going after. Each one a symbol of the town's complicity, its unchecked privilege, its hidden rot. From Officer Garrett, who had harassed Mason, to the well-to-do families who had thrived in ignorance of the pain around them. Each victim had a part to play in the story of Pinewood's unspoken sins. The town was paralyzed by fear. No one could explain how such a thing could happen, and no one wanted to believe it. People whispered behind closed doors, the news spreading like a disease. The investigation began immediately, but there was little to go on. No witnesses had seen the attackers. No security footage. No clear motives beyond the blood-soaked horror of the night. It was as if the perpetrators had evaporated into thin air. Detective Harold McKinney was the one called to oversee the investigation. He was a man who had lived in Pinewood for his entire life, a man who knew the town's secrets like the back of his hand. But as he stepped into the carnage, his breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anything like this. Not in his years of service, not in his darkest nightmares. There was no order to it, no sense of control. The detective scanned the room, his eyes darting from one mangled corpse to another. The brutality of it gnawed at him. This wasn't the work of a stranger. This wasn't random violence. Someone had carefully planned this. Someone who knew Pinewood like the back of their hand, who understood its people and its vulnerabilities. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. The killer, or killers, had been there all along. The town's first instinct was denial. The wealthy families of Pinewood, those who had always considered themselves insulated from the problems of the outside world, were the first to circle their wagons. They held meetings in their pristine living rooms, talked in hushed tones behind closed doors, all while trying to maintain an air of control. Their children had been at the heart of this nightmare. The victims were all connected to the town's elite, people of power, influence, and privilege. But no one wanted to believe it. The idea that their own could be capable of such horrific acts was too much for them to bear. The first suspects were obvious. Anyone with a motive, anyone with a history of violence, anyone who had been at the scene. But there were no clear leads. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The town was too tight-knit, too small for anything to go unnoticed. And yet, the silence that followed the massacre was absolute. As the days passed, Detective McKinney began to focus his attention on the three girls. Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia had been quiet since the massacre. Too quiet, some thought. They had no alibis for the night in question, and the more the detective dug, the more he realized that they had all been in the town during the massacre. The more he dug, the more he discovered that they had been on the periphery of every important event in the girls' lives. Every bit of trauma, every broken family, every whisper of violence. It didn't take long for McKinney to piece together the disturbing truth. These girls had been living with a darkness far deeper than anyone could have guessed. But still, there were no clear answers. The girls were too young to have carried out such a horrific act, and yet the suspicion surrounding them grew. People began to look at them differently. The girls, once ignored by most, now became the center of every conversation. Parents warned their children to stay away from them. Teachers gave them wary glances, and the town's residents murmured behind their hands, as if they could will the truth into existence. No one had proof, but everyone was sure they knew who was responsible. The way Jasmine carried herself, the way Zuri's eyes seemed to burn with unspoken rage, the cold, emotionless way Talia had moved. Everything about them screamed guilt. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the girls were more than just suspects. They were the town's scapegoats, its outcasts, its darkest reflection. The townspeople began to draw connections where there were none. They were looking for someone to blame, someone to offer up as the embodiment of the horror that had swept through their lives. But the truth was more complicated. Detective McKinney felt a strange pull towards the girls, a sense that the answers lay hidden somewhere beneath their eyes, somewhere behind their hardened exteriors. They were not innocent, not in the traditional sense, but neither were they the monsters the town imagined them to be. The detective couldn't shake the thought that Pinewood, in its pursuit of normalcy and order, had built the very creatures who now haunted it. As the weeks wore on, the town of Pinewood became a place of suspicion, a town where neighbors no longer spoke to each other, where every interaction felt loaded with a sense of impending violence. The investigation stalled, the pieces of the puzzle scattered, just out of reach. The girls remained silent, their faces unreadable, their actions ambiguous. But in their silence, they were guilty in the eyes of everyone who had ever turned a blind eye. The town was fractured, no longer a place of comfort, but a place of tension, of fear. And then, one evening, when the town was at its most quiet, a letter arrived. It was unsigned, its contents vague but chilling. It was a confession, or perhaps a warning. It spoke of pain, of revenge, of a reckoning that had been a long time coming. It hinted at the girls but never named them directly. It suggested that the town's rot had been festering for years, and the bloodshed was merely the beginning. The town, terrified and confused, had no idea what would come next. As the days bled into each other, the town of Pinewood was held in a vice of mounting terror. The investigation had come to a standstill, and suspicion hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating everyone beneath it. But beneath the tension, something darker was stirring. The truth, the real truth, had never been far. The girls had woven their silence like a shroud, but now it was time for it to unravel. It came late one evening, when the town's restless breath was almost audible. Detective McKinney, driven by an uneasy feeling, had returned to the remains of Officer Garrett's house, the place where it all began. He stood there, staring at the wreckage, his mind a cacophony of unanswered questions. Something was missing. Then, amidst the wreckage, something caught his eye. A scrap of paper, so small it could have been overlooked, but the handwriting was unmistakable. A name, a date, a map. A chilling promise. The pieces fell together all at once, as though the walls between the past and the present had cracked open. The girls had been orchestrating this all along. They weren't just victims, they had been the executioners from the start. Their pain, their rage, had festered for years, and this night, this blood-soaked night, had been the inevitable reckoning. They had known the town's darkest secrets, had become its very shadow, and in the end, it wasn't about vengeance, it was about cleansing. The truth, cold and unforgiving, shattered the silence. The girls had become both judge and executioner. They had unleashed the nightmare Pinewood had buried for so long. Hannah Fisher was the kind of child whose presence went unnoticed. Her petite frame and soft, wispy blonde hair made her appear delicate, even fragile. She was a quiet girl who seemed to fade into the background, blending effortlessly with the other students at Oak Ridge Elementary School. Her face, round and pale, had the softness of a child, still untouched by the weight of the world, her wide blue eyes always holding a distant, almost absent look, as though she was watching something far away that no one else could see. To her classmates, Hannah was invisible. Neither bullied nor particularly befriended, she simply existed. She never spoke unless spoken to, never took the lead in any group activity, and always did her homework with a silent diligence that went unnoticed by most of her teachers. In a school filled with boisterous children eager for attention, Hannah's silence was a welcome reprieve. She had no standout qualities, no quirks that made her special in the eyes of others. She was ordinary, unremarkable, unseen. Her home life mirrored this quiet existence. Hannah lived with her mother, Sarah Fisher, in a small, nondescript house on the outskirts of the town. Sarah, a single mother who worked long hours as a nurse, was often too tired to engage with her daughter beyond the bare necessities. She provided meals and took care of the basics: laundry, school supplies, and the occasional trip to the grocery store. But beyond that, there was little emotional connection. Sarah loved her daughter, of course, but her exhaustion left her with little energy for anything more than the surface-level interactions that could be categorized as routine. The deep, maternal connection that some mothers shared with their children was never fully realized in their relationship. At home, Hannah spent her days in silence, often retreating to her room with its dull gray walls and lone bed covered in a faded floral comforter. There, she would sit for hours, sketching in her notebook, her small, nimble fingers gliding over the pages. Her drawings were the only window into her soul, a place where she could escape into a world entirely of her own making. Her sketches were dark, sometimes disturbing, a sharp contrast to the innocent image most people had of her. Faces twisted in agony, grotesque shapes, sharp angles and shadows that seemed to consume the light. Hannah didn't draw flowers or animals like other children. Instead, she drew the things that haunted her mind: strange, unsettling figures lurking in corners, eyes with no pupils, hands reaching out of black voids. She never showed these drawings to anyone, not even her mother. They were her secrets, her private thoughts, locked away in the silent solitude of her room. Her teachers noticed her withdrawn behavior, but none thought much of it. She was a model student in the sense that she never caused problems, and that was enough. Mrs. Reynolds, her homeroom teacher, once observed Hannah in class, her fingers tapping nervously against the desk as she gazed at the window, her thoughts far away. Mrs. Reynolds assumed it was just typical daydreaming, the kind that came with being a child. But what she didn't understand was that Hannah was never really daydreaming. She was trapped in a world of her own making, a world where the darkness was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of her calm exterior. As months passed, Hannah's silence became more pronounced. She began to sit in the back of the classroom, avoiding eye contact with her peers, her gaze often fixed on the floor or out the window. Her classmates didn't mind. They had their own lives to lead, their own dramas to worry about. But what they didn't know was that there was something growing inside Hannah. Something dark, something no one could see. He'd become a facilitator, for these talks to be honored, and Hannah's voice to pass the time. No one could know that the girl who never spoke, never raised her hand, was silently plotting her place in a world that had never truly noticed her. At night, when the house grew still and the shadows crept along the walls, Hannah would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, her thoughts running rampant in the quiet of her room. Her mind was a constant barrage of images, of faces, some familiar, others unknown, all distorted in ways that made her stomach twist. She would sometimes whisper to herself, the words unintelligible, a murmur of thoughts too chaotic to articulate. The darkness seemed to press in on her, suffocating her, making her feel like she was drowning in a world where no one cared. No one looked close enough to see the cracks forming in her soul. But it wasn't just the darkness that consumed her thoughts. It was the anger, the quiet, simmering rage that had begun to take root. Hannah had always felt small, insignificant, and unnoticed. The world had never paid attention to her, never asked her how she felt or what she wanted. She was nothing more than a background figure in the lives of those around her, her classmates, her teachers, even her mother. Everyone was too busy to notice her, to see the signs of her growing discontent. To them, she was just another quiet, forgotten child. But inside, something had begun to shift. The world that had ignored her for so long was about to feel the weight of her presence. Hannah began to fantasize about what it would be like to make them notice her, really notice her. She imagined herself standing tall in front of her classmates, commanding their attention. She saw their faces, twisted in shock, terror, and disbelief as they realized who she was. The girl who had been invisible, who had been dismissed, was now the center of it all. The thought filled her with a strange satisfaction, a feeling of power that she had never known before. It was intoxicating. Her days at school grew more unsettling. She began to observe the other children more closely, studying them with a disquieting intensity. They didn't know it, but she was already making mental notes. Who would she target? Who would she make pay for the cruelty and indifference they had shown her? The small acts of exclusion, the laughter behind her back, the way they ignored her when she tried to speak. These moments of rejection festered in her mind, growing into something far more dangerous. She would never forget the way they had treated her, the way they had left her to rot in the shadows while they basked in their own little worlds of popularity and belonging. It wasn't fair. And soon it would no longer matter, because Hannah Fisher, the quiet, overlooked girl, would no longer be a shadow. She would no longer fade into the background. The world would see her for what she was, what she had always been, and when it did, it would never forget her again. In the stillness of her room, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the quiet, invisible girl who had always been ignored began to transform. The world would soon learn that Hannah Fisher, the one no one had ever noticed, would be the one they could never forget. And that was only the beginning. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, something inside Hannah Fisher continued to shift. Her quiet nature, which had once been mistaken for innocence, began to take on a darker edge. It wasn't an immediate change, but something more insidious, a slow burn beneath the surface that no one could see. The small, seemingly harmless patterns of behavior became sharper, more unsettling, like cracks forming in a facade that everyone had assumed was solid. At school, Hannah's interactions with her classmates grew even more infrequent. She withdrew further into herself, retreating into her own little world. While others gathered in groups to gossip or play, Hannah could always be found sitting alone. She would position herself near the back of the classroom, choosing seats where she could be as far from others as possible. Her gaze would drift toward the window, her expression vacant. There was no curiosity in her eyes, no interest in what the others were doing. She wasn't curious about the world anymore. The world had long since ceased to hold any value for her. Teachers occasionally noted the change in her. At first, they thought it was just a phase, a natural part of growing up, maybe even a sign of maturity. But as time wore on, they began to worry. Her once punctual homework assignments became erratic, some completed with a sudden, cold perfection, others abandoned halfway through. In class, she was often distracted, her attention drifting away from the lessons. At times, her desk would remain untouched for hours as she stared into space, her mind locked in a place no one else could reach. But it wasn't just a lack of focus that marked the change in Hannah. Her temperament began to shift. What had once been the soft-spoken girl with a nervous smile was now replaced by someone who seemed more volatile. Hannah's responses became curt, abrupt, and often delivered with a touch of bitterness that no one could quite place. When someone spoke to her, she would offer a brief, almost dismissive answer, as though the conversation held no meaning. It was as though a barrier had been erected between her and the rest of the world, one that seemed increasingly difficult to breach. And then there was the anger. It wasn't loud or explosive. No, it was quieter than that, far more terrifying in its stillness. It was the kind of anger that simmered beneath the surface, creeping out in small, almost imperceptible ways. It showed itself in the way Hannah would clench her fists when a classmate walked by, her eyes narrowing for a brief second, as if she were about to snap. It appeared when she scowled at someone's smile, or when she pulled away from a touch, as if the very act of human connection repulsed her. She didn't yell or scream like a typical child might when upset. No, her anger was something far more controlled, more calculated. It manifested itself, too, in the things she did when she thought no one was watching. She would linger after class, pushing her pencil into the paper with unnerving force, as though trying to dig into the very fibers of the desk. When she was alone, her sketches became darker. Once simple drawings of trees and flowers were now replaced with twisted faces and grotesque figures, their eyes hollow, their expressions twisted in pain or terror. The images on the pages were a reflection of the growing darkness inside her, a darkness that no one could understand. But the most chilling change came in the way she looked at people. Hannah's gaze became more intense, more unsettling. She began to study people with an almost clinical precision, as if she were dissecting them, analyzing every detail of their appearance, their movements, their words. It wasn't the curiosity of a child trying to understand the world. It was the gaze of someone who saw others as little more than objects, pieces in a puzzle to be moved around. She would watch her classmates from the corners of her eyes, her expression unreadable as they laughed and joked with one another. When they turned their backs, she would look at them with a quiet, hollow hatred, a disgust that was invisible to everyone but her. At home, things were no better. Sarah, her mother, remained largely unaware of the growing storm within her daughter. She was tired, worn thin by the long hours at the hospital, and she could barely keep up with the basic needs of their household. She provided food, shelter, and the occasional reassurance that everything would be okay. But the emotional connection between them had become strained. Hannah's silence only deepened the gap between them. Sarah chalked it up to the usual growing pains of adolescence, too distracted by her own struggles to notice that her daughter had drifted further away from her. On some nights, Hannah would wander into the living room, her small, pale face barely visible in the dim light, her eyes scanning the shadows as if they held answers she couldn't quite reach. She would sit in the corner, rocking back and forth, her fingers clutching the edges of her worn-out sweater, her breath shallow and uneven. She wasn't looking for comfort. She wasn't seeking affection. She was waiting. Waiting for something that would never come. The anger within her continued to fester, to grow stronger, more demanding. It was a quiet rage, one that refused to be acknowledged, one that refused to be understood. It was the kind of anger that only knew destruction, that only knew how to tear things down. It wasn't just directed at those who had hurt her. It was an all-consuming rage, one that burned brightly even when there was nothing specific to focus it on. The world around her had failed her, ignored her, dismissed her, and she had taken that pain and twisted it into something dark, something dangerous. It wasn't long before the seeds of this anger began to find their outlet. It started with small acts of rebellion. She would deface her notebooks with sharp, jagged lines, tearing through the pages with her pen until they were a mess of ink and paper. She would snap at teachers when they tried to ask her to participate, her voice laced with venom, her words biting and sharp. When the other children laughed or ignored her, she felt a fire burning in her chest, a fire that could no longer be contained. And though it was small at first, those moments, those bursts of fury, began to add up. One afternoon during recess, she overheard a group of girls gossiping behind her back. They were talking about her, the quiet, strange girl who no one really understood. They mocked her, calling her names under their breath, their laughter ringing in her ears like nails on a chalkboard. The words cut through her, but instead of crying or retreating into herself as she had always done, something in her snapped. For a brief moment she turned, her eyes blazing with a dark fury, and glared at the girls. They didn't see her, didn't notice the subtle shift in her demeanor. They didn't notice that the small, quiet girl had finally had enough. But the rage was there, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. It wasn't long before that moment arrived. The loneliness, the isolation, the deep, gnawing sense of betrayal all came to a head, and when it did, it would consume everything in its path, everything she had ever known, everyone she had ever seen. And the world would finally realize that the quiet, innocent girl they had ignored for so long was not as harmless as they had once thought. Hannah Fisher's transformation had begun slowly, almost imperceptibly, but as the days wore on, the darkness inside her became impossible to ignore. She no longer felt like a passive observer of her own life. She had become an active participant in the disintegration of her sanity. The quiet, invisible girl had been replaced by someone more dangerous, someone driven by a deep, unrelenting obsession with a world that had never shown her kindness. The rage she had so carefully concealed for years now bubbled to the surface, and with it came an insatiable hunger for something more, something darker. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and now her every thought, her every action, was consumed by a single, overpowering desire to make the world pay for what it had done to her. Hannah had always been meticulous in her isolation, carefully managing the image others had of her. She had learned to wear her silence like armor, to blend in with the walls, to never stand out. But beneath that calm exterior, a storm had been brewing. The facade she had so carefully crafted for years was crumbling, its cracks widening until it no longer held together. It started with the obsession, an obsession that slowly seeped into her every waking moment, growing stronger, louder, until it was all she could hear. It was the only thing that made sense to her now. The idea that she could make people notice her, make them feel the same suffocating isolation she had endured for so long, became an all-consuming thought. At first, the obsession was harmless. She found herself fixated on the smallest details, her classmates' conversations, their laughter, the way they looked at each other with a sense of belonging she would never know. She began to observe their every movement, cataloging the way they spoke, the way they walked, the way they interacted. But it wasn't enough. The more she watched, the more she wanted to be a part of it all, not in a healthy way, but in a way that twisted the very essence of her desire for connection into something darker, something sinister. Her obsession grew with each passing day, becoming more focused, more deliberate. She began to study her classmates, not just from a distance, but up close. She would sit in the back of the classroom, her sharp blue eyes scanning their faces, memorizing their expressions, reading the way they reacted to each other's words. She knew who laughed the loudest, who had the most friends, who had the power to make others follow their lead. He loved her dark hair. Her most favorite book was The Honor of the Downing Street. They all seemed so perfect, so content with their little lives. But to Hannah, they were nothing more than puppets in a play she was no longer willing to be a part of. The more she observed, the more she realized how insignificant she had been in their eyes. No one cared. No one paid attention to the girl who sat at the back, the one who never raised her hand, the one who never made a sound. She was nothing, and they were everything. This realization festered inside her, feeding the obsession until it was all-consuming. She began to fantasize about what it would feel like to have control over them, to have them notice her, to make them realize just how wrong they had been, to overlook her, to dismiss her. It wasn't enough to just be seen anymore. She wanted more. She wanted them to feel the same isolation she had felt for all those years. She wanted to strip them of their confidence, to expose their vulnerability, to tear down everything they took for granted. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the only way to do that, to make them understand her pain, was to make them pay. The fantasies began to grow more elaborate. She would sit in her room at night, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor, and her mind would race with dark thoughts. She pictured herself standing in front of her classmates, their faces twisted in terror as they realized what she was capable of. She imagined them begging for mercy, only to see the cold indifference in her eyes. She imagined the world around her crumbling as she finally took control of her own fate. The power, the control, the recognition, it all swirled together in a toxic, dizzying mix that consumed her thoughts. It was during one of these late-night reveries that she first began to plan. She wasn't sure when the thoughts became actions, but somewhere along the line she made the decision. The plan, in its early stages, was simple. She would make them notice her, force them to understand. She would be the center of attention, the one they couldn't ignore, the one they would never forget. Her first step was preparation. She began to collect items in secret. It started with simple things, sharp objects she could find around the house. A kitchen knife, scissors, a set of old unused razor blades. She hid them in the bottom of her school bag, away from prying eyes. But the items weren't just tools, they were symbols. Symbols of the control she would soon have over those who had never paid her the time of day. Every day, she would spend hours alone in her room, planning the details of her act. She wasn't just obsessing over the mechanics of what she would do, she was obsessed with the idea of the aftermath, with how it would all play out. She imagined the look on their faces, the shock, the horror. She imagined the media coverage, the police, the investigators, the world finally noticing her. Then, in her mind, this would be her moment, her chance to make them all see her, to force them to reckon with her pain, her silence, her rage. But it wasn't just about them. It was about her, too. It was about reclaiming something she felt had been stolen from her, the right to be seen, to be heard, to be more than just a quiet, insignificant figure fading into the background. What they had overlooked for so long, she would now force them to recognize. And as the days passed, as the plan took shape, her obsession deepened. She became more calculated, more methodical. She practiced the movements in the privacy of her room, imagining herself as a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of chaos and terror. She watched videos, read articles, learned about the techniques used by those who had made their own marks on the world through violence. She studied their behavior, their methods, their mental states. They weren't just monsters in her eyes. They were teachers, guides, roadmaps for her own descent into madness. The more she immersed herself in the dark fantasies that consumed her, the more detached she became from reality. The line between what she imagined and what she was capable of blurring with each passing day. Her obsession grew until it filled every crevice of her mind. There was nothing else. There was no turning back. The day of the attack was set. She would wait for the perfect moment, for the time when the chaos would be greatest, when no one would be able to stop her. It would be a moment of perfect clarity, of perfect execution. She would show them. She would show. And as Hannah lay in bed that night, Her fingers trembling with anticipation, she realized that nothing had ever felt so certain. The world would never forget her again. This was no longer about revenge. It was about rebirth. The girl who had once been invisible, forgotten, would become something else entirely, a force to be reckoned with, and the world would have to face the consequences. The sun had barely begun to rise over the sprawling suburban landscape of the small California town where Hannah Fisher lived. It was a quiet morning, the kind that often heralded a day filled with routine and mundane chores, the kind that would be forgotten by dusk. But for Hannah, this was not just another day. This was the day she had meticulously planned, the day when the darkness that had been growing inside her would finally erupt, when everything would change, not just for her, but for everyone. She woke to the sound of her alarm clock ringing softly in the corner of her room. For a brief moment, it felt like any other morning, the mundane hum of daily life pressing down on her. She stretched out her arms and yawned, the sheets cool against her skin. Her mind, however, was far from the peacefulness of sleep. In her head, the plan was already in motion, the details locked in place. This wasn't a moment of uncertainty or fear. It was a moment of calm, a moment of certainty. Hannah had spent the night before preparing, checking and rechecking everything she had gathered over the past few weeks. Her school bag was packed, the sharp objects she had hidden in the folds of fabric now a cold weight against her back. She had no doubt that today would be her day. The thought had consumed her every waking hour, the anticipation building in her chest, a tight knot of excitement and dread. She had done everything she needed to do to ensure that nothing would go wrong. Every step, every movement had been calculated. She was in control. And today, the world would see her for who she truly was. The house was still and silent when she made her way down the stairs, the only sound the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. Her mother, as usual, was still asleep, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Hannah moved quietly, methodically, as though every action was part of a script she had memorized. She grabbed a piece of toast from the kitchen, a half-hearted attempt at normalcy, before slipping her bag over her shoulder. For the first time in a long while, she felt nothing but a cold emptiness inside. She didn't need to feel fear, or guilt, or regret. She didn't need to feel anything at all. All she needed was to carry out her plan. The drive to school was uneventful, the world outside seeming almost detached, as though the morning itself were holding its breath. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with a steady, unshaking force. Her eyes focused on the road ahead. It was a quiet drive, no distractions, no noise, just the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt. She passed by the familiar landmarks, the coffee shop she used to visit, the gas station with the broken sign. But none of it mattered now. The world outside was fading. The world inside her, the world that had been twisted and darkened by years of neglect, rejection, and cruelty, was all that was real. As she entered the school parking lot, her heart began to race. It wasn't a feeling of anxiety, nor was it the usual rush of adrenaline. It was something else entirely, something far colder. It was the sensation of control, the knowledge that the moment had arrived. Hannah knew exactly where everyone would be. She knew the layout of the school, the best places to go, and the quickest ways to escape if needed. She had studied the halls, the classrooms, the exits. Everything was in place. Nothing would stand in her way. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridors as she walked toward the classroom where her first target would be. The bell rang, signaling the start of the day, but for Hannah, the noise was nothing more than background static. She was already beyond the reach of time. As she passed her classmates in the hallway, their faces blurred together like a mass of meaningless shapes. They were all the same to her now, just pieces in a game she was playing. She saw them, but they did not see her. Inside the classroom, the familiar chatter of students and the rustling of books filled the air, but it all sounded distant, as though it were happening in another world. She took her seat at the back of the room, as always, the weight of her school bag pressing down on her shoulder. The teacher, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, gave her a quick glance as he began the lesson. He didn't suspect anything. None of them did. She sat perfectly still, her eyes scanning the room. Her classmates were oblivious to the storm gathering just beyond their awareness. To them, Hannah was the quiet girl in the back corner, the one who never raised her hand, the one who kept to herself. She was invisible. And that was exactly how she wanted it, because today they would all see her. Today she would make them see. The lesson dragged on, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. But Hannah did not waver. She waited. Her hands were steady on her desk, her fingers twitching ever so slightly, as if they were already preparing for what was to come. Her eyes never left the teacher, following his movements with an eerie intensity. It was almost as if she were studying him, as if she were already planning her next move. And she was. The moment would come soon. As the teacher turned to write something on the board, Hannah's eyes shifted to the students in front of her. They were laughing, joking, sharing the kind of moments she had always been excluded from. Their voices were like nails on a chalkboard, every word a reminder of the years of torment, of being forgotten, of being nothing. It made her stomach twist, a surge of cold anger rushing through her veins. They would never laugh again. Not in the same way. She slipped her hand into her bag, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the weapon she had hidden there. The classroom was too quiet now, too still. Hannah's pulse quickened. She had reached the tipping point. She had no choice but to act. It wasn't just for herself, it was for everyone who had ever ignored her, belittled her, made her feel small. It was for the world that had rejected her, that had made her feel insignificant. And today, she would show them that she was not to be dismissed any longer. Without warning, the first strike came. It was quick, a blur of motion, as she pulled the weapon from her bag and lunged forward. The initial shock of the attack sent the classroom into chaos. Screams erupted, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor, the panicked shuffling of feet. But Hannah didn't stop. She moved with precision, methodical in her actions, as if she were carrying out a task that had been long overdue. Each blow was calculated, each movement deliberate. Her heart raced, but there was no fear, no hesitation. There was only a cold, unrelenting focus. The classroom was no longer a place of learning. It was a battlefield, and she was the one in control. The once comfortable room, filled with the mundane chatter of students and the hum of a normal school day, was now filled with chaos, terror, and the unmistakable scent of blood. As she moved through the school, the chaos spread like wildfire. Classrooms became death traps. Hallways turned into mazes of horror. Teachers, students, faculty members. No one was safe. The terror that Hannah unleashed in those moments was pure and unfiltered. There was no room for mercy, no room for regret. This was her moment, the culmination of years of pain, of isolation, of rejection. This was the reckoning. And by the time the first responders arrived, it was already too late. The school, once a place of learning and safety, was now a crime scene. The halls were littered with bodies, the walls stained with the evidence of a nightmare come to life. And through it all, one thing was certain. Hannah Fisher had made the world see her. She had finally taken control, and in that cold, calculated rage, she had left behind a trail of destruction that no one would ever forget. The carnage that had erupted in the school was still unfolding when Hannah slipped away from the chaos. The screams of terror and the wailing sirens became muffled in her ears as she moved with deliberate precision, her steps soundless against the floor. The blood of her victims was still fresh on her clothes, the weight of her actions pressing down on her, but she didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything at all. Her mind was a cold void, detached from the destruction she had caused, as if it was all just a distant dream, something she couldn't fully comprehend. The escape was not an accident. It was part of the plan. Every detail had been accounted for, every potential outcome anticipated. For weeks, Hannah had studied the layout of the school, memorizing the best routes, the least obvious places to hide, and the moments when people would be most distracted. She knew exactly how to disappear into the chaos without drawing attention. Her escape wasn't a fluke. It was a calculated move, a chance to slip away from the rubble of her own creation and vanish before the authorities arrived. As the hallway stretched out before her, she moved quickly, blending into the shadows like a ghost. Her breathing was steady, controlled, her mind razor-sharp despite the madness that had just consumed her life. The adrenaline that surged through her veins was not the frantic panic one would expect from a young girl fleeing the scene of a massacre. Instead, it was a quiet, unnerving calm, as though she were simply walking through another day at school, albeit with a much darker purpose. She passed the bodies of those who had been unlucky enough to be in her path. Some were still twitching, others were motionless, their eyes wide open in horror, staring at nothing. It should have made her sick, this grotesque display of human suffering, but it didn't. In fact, it almost felt as if the violence had a purpose, as though the world had been made right in her own twisted way. The bodies on the ground were not the end, but the beginning. I saw her mouth. They were the proof of her power, her strength, her ability to control the fate of those who had once overlooked her. They were the last proof of her existence before she disappeared into the abyss. Her name spoken only in whispers. Hannah had no intention of being caught. The plan wasn't just to kill, it was to vanish, to slip away and leave behind a trail of confusion and fear. She had made sure no one would be able to find her easily. Her clothes had been chosen carefully, designed to blend in with the surroundings. Her shoes made no sound as they touched the linoleum floors. She moved quickly and without hesitation, avoiding the areas where first responders were beginning to gather, where the flashing lights and chaos would surely give her away. Her mind raced, but there were no thoughts of regret or remorse. There were only the facts. She needed to leave, to be gone before the world could catch up with her. The escape wasn't just about running from the authorities. It was about something deeper, something buried far beneath the surface of her twisted mind. For Hannah, the act of leaving was an escape from the girl she had once been, from the innocent child who had been ignored, overlooked, and ridiculed. As she neared the exit, her heart began to thump more rapidly in her chest. The air around her seemed to grow thicker, heavier with the sense of impending danger. She had crossed a line now, a line from which there was no return. The outside world awaited her, but it wasn't the world she had known. It would be a world where she would never be a victim again, a world where she would be the one to decide who lived and who died. The exit doors loomed ahead, and she hesitated only for a moment. This was the last step. This was where the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. She had orchestrated this moment with such care, such precision, that there was no room for error. She had no intention of going quietly. She had no intention of letting anyone stop her. The authorities, the media, the world. They would never understand. They would never see the years of pain and rejection that had driven her to this point. They would never know the depth of the rage that had festered inside her for so long, waiting for the perfect moment to explode. No one could understand what she had done, and no one would ever have the chance to. Her hand reached for the door, the cool metal handle beneath her fingers sending a shiver up her spine. As she pushed it open, the cold air outside hit her face like a slap. It was a stark contrast to the warmth of the school's interior, a chilling reminder that the world beyond was vastly different, but she didn't care. The outside world was just another stage for her performance, another place where she could rewrite the rules, bend the laws of society to her will. The parking lot was empty, save for a few cars left behind by students who had yet to arrive or had already fled the scene. Hannah's car sat in the farthest corner, partially hidden by a line of trees. She had chosen this car intentionally. It was old, inconspicuous, and registered under a fake name. No one would ever be able to trace her movements once she was in it. She was already disappearing, her face blending into the crowd of the faceless, her past blending into the fog of uncertainty. Sliding into the driver's seat, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, a pale face framed by dark, tangled hair, her eyes still vacant, hollow. It was almost as if she were staring at a stranger, and in many ways she was. The girl who had entered that school in the morning no longer existed. What remained was something darker, something that had shed its former self, shedding the fragile threads of humanity like a snake shedding its skin. The engine roared to life, the sound vibrating through her body as she pulled out of the parking lot, her eyes fixed ahead. The school, the bodies, the chaos. Everything was behind her now. It was as if none of it had ever existed. The world had been reset, and she was its creator, its destroyer. She was free, but there was one thing that Hannah couldn't escape: the knowledge of what she had done. The truth was buried beneath layers of denial and self-justification, but it was still there, gnawing at her insides. The emptiness she had felt after the massacre wasn't just about her escape. It was about the void that had always been there, the void that would never be filled. It was as she sped down the road, her grip tightening on the steering wheel, Hannah realized the escape wasn't just from the authorities, from the aftermath of the massacre. It was from herself. And no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she went, she would never outrun what she had become. The aftermath of the massacre left a scar that would never heal. The once lively school campus, where students had walked the hallways, talked and laughed with one another, was now an eerie silence, punctuated only by the distant hum of sirens and the heavy boots of officers shuffling over blood-stained floors. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles bathed the scene in a cold, harsh glow, casting long shadows across the shattered remnants of lives, memories, and futures. But it wasn't just the physical destruction that haunted the town. It was the unanswered questions, the why, the how, and, most chillingly, the fact that no one had seen it coming. Not a single person had suspected that Hannah Fisher, the quiet, withdrawn girl in the back of the class, was capable of such a horrifying act. There were no signs, no warnings that could have prepared anyone for the depth of her rage, the precision of her plan. The school's principal, who had always considered himself a vigilant protector of his students, was left speechless, staring at the empty seats in his office, wondering how he had failed. It was as if Hannah had never existed before that morning. And yet, in the wake of the massacre, everyone seemed to remember her in pieces. A girl who had kept to herself, a girl who never asked for help, a girl who had been overlooked. The faculty and students struggled to make sense of it, to understand how someone so invisible could have concealed such a dark, violent force within her. Was she simply a product of neglect? Was there something in her past, something so horrifying that it had pushed her over the edge? As the investigation began, the authorities pored over every shred of evidence they could find. Security footage, her social media activity, the contents of her bedroom, interviews with classmates, teachers, and even her parents. But there were no easy answers. Her online presence was sparse, almost empty. No public rants, no signs of aggression. She was a ghost, a blank page in a digital world. Her parents, stunned and terrified, claimed to have no idea that their daughter was capable of such violence, though their own actions were soon called into question. They had been too busy, too absent to see the warning signs. But who could blame them? Hannah had hidden herself so well behind the mask of normalcy that even those who should have known her best had missed the cracks. The most chilling part of the aftermath was the realization that Hannah hadn't just been aiming for the lives of her victims. She had been aiming for the world itself. Her escape, the coldness with which she had executed her plan, was proof that this was not an act of impulse. It was a carefully crafted statement, one that she intended to send to everyone who had ever doubted her, ignored her, or dismissed her as just another quiet girl. She had taken control, shattered the illusion of safety that had surrounded the school, and disappeared into the void. But no one knew where she had gone, or even if she was still alive. As the weeks passed, the town became a ghost town of its own, haunted by the memories of what had happened, and by the chilling uncertainty of where Hannah was now. The police pursued every lead, but she had vanished without a trace. No phone records, no witnesses who could recall seeing her after the massacre. It was as though she had slipped through the cracks, leaving nothing but destruction in her wake. The uncertainty gnawed at the edges of the investigation, making it feel like the horror had never truly ended. There was always the lingering question: why? Why had this happened? And why her? In the absence of answers, fear took root. The once bright halls of the school became a memorial, a place to remember the victims, but also to question how well they really knew each other. The tragedy had fractured the community, leaving behind a sense of unease that would never truly fade. Every time a car pulled into the parking lot, every time someone walked through the front door of the school, there was a moment of tense silence. Who could be next? Was there another Hannah Fisher hiding in the crowd, waiting for the right moment? The town had learned one painful truth. The monsters were not always the ones who roared the loudest. Sometimes, they were the ones who blended in, silent, invisible, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And until that moment came, no one would ever know how close they had been to the edge. Hannah Williams had always been the quiet one in the family. At 12 years old, she was the youngest of 3 children, but she had always felt like the outsider in her own home. Her older brother Ethan was the golden child, the charming, athletic teen who could do no wrong. He was popular at school, always surrounded by friends, always the first to speak up at the dinner table, the first to get attention. Her older sister Amanda was the typical teenage rebel, the one who fought with their parents constantly, but despite her anger and attitude, she had the ability to command a room when she walked into it. Hannah, by contrast, never knew how to assert herself. She didn't have Ethan's confidence, nor Amanda's rebellious spirit. She was just there, always in the background, always silent, always unnoticed. Her mother, Grace, often spoke about her like she was some sort of delicate flower, fragile, shy, and in need of constant protection. Grace would go on and on about how sensitive Hannah was, as though it were some kind of flaw. Grace didn't understand the darkness inside her daughter, the way Hannah would sometimes stare at the world with hollow eyes, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Hannah's father, Daniel, was a man of few words, a successful lawyer who worked long hours and often came home late, too tired to pay attention to anything but his own exhaustion. He never took the time to ask his children how they were feeling. He didn't know about Hannah's nightly rituals of slipping into her room after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting on her windowsill, staring out into the empty night, imagining what it would feel like to disappear, to make them all notice her for once. For years, Hannah had kept her feelings hidden. She absorbed the constant verbal jabs from her siblings, the overbearing concern from her mother, the cold indifference from her father. She was used to it, used to being invisible, used to the lack of attention. But the truth was, no one ever asked what was really going on inside her. No one ever took the time to notice the signs, the way her eyes would flicker with something darker whenever someone mentioned the word family or togetherness. It wasn't that she wanted to be loved, not in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something more visceral. Hannah wanted to be seen for who she was, to be acknowledged for the pain she carried inside her chest, the weight of being ignored, the rage that simmered just below the surface. And yet, every time she tried to show it, every time she felt the urge to speak out, the words got stuck in her throat. They were buried under layers of silence, layers that had been built over the years like the walls of a fortress, protecting her from the world she could never quite fit into. Her parents, especially Grace, would have called her shy, introverted, maybe even anxious, but Hannah knew the truth. She wasn't shy. She wasn't anxious. She was angry. Angry at the way her family treated her, angry at how they never took the time to understand who she really was, angry at how they never listened. And the longer she stayed silent, the more that anger grew, festered, coiled up like a snake inside her chest. It was always there, waiting, watching. It whispered to her during quiet moments, in the stillness of the night when the house was asleep, telling her that everything would be different if they just noticed her, if they just saw her. She didn't want their sympathy or their pity, she wanted their acknowledgement, their respect. But most of all, she wanted them to feel the weight of her silence, to feel the suffocating presence of someone who had been left behind, who had been forgotten. At school, things were no better. Hannah's classmates barely knew she existed. She sat in the back of the room, never raising her hand, never making eye contact with anyone. It wasn't that she was unpopular, she wasn't. She just didn't care. She didn't want to be part of their world. There were times when she would sit alone at lunch, watching the other kids talk and laugh, and she would wonder if she would ever find a way out of this cycle. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to. It felt like there was no escape, and when she went home, it was just the same. The same cold house, the same cold people, the same empty silences. Her family never suspected a thing. They didn't know what Hannah was capable of, what she had planned in the deep recesses of her mind, those twisted fantasies that began to take shape in the late hours of the night. They never knew about the anger that gnawed at her insides, about the long, secret conversations she had with herself, conversations about what it would take to make everything stop. They didn't know about the daydreams where she imagined herself standing in the middle of the house, holding something sharp, making them finally look at her, finally notice her. It wasn't just about hurting them, it was about power. It was about control, about showing them that she could make them feel something, anything. She could make them see her. The idea of a family trip came about out of nowhere. Grace had planned it as a way to reconnect, as a way to bond. They were going to Arizona for a week, staying at a secluded cabin in the middle of the desert. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a break from the routine. Grace was always trying to fix things, always trying to make everything perfect. But Hannah couldn't see it that way. A trip wouldn't fix what had been broken for so long. A trip wouldn't change the way her family treated her, the way they overlooked her. No, the trip was just another excuse for them to ignore her, to pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. The desert cabin might as well have been a prison to her, just another place where she would be invisible, just another place where her feelings would be ignored. On the second day of the trip, Hannah began to feel the familiar pull, the pull of rage, of resentment, of the suffocating weight of her own silence. The desert outside was vast and empty, just like she felt inside. And as she watched the sun set over the barren landscape, the anger inside her began to build once more. It was as if the silence of the desert mirrored the silence she had lived with her entire life. And in that silence, she finally found clarity. Her family wasn't going to fix themselves. They weren't going to listen to her. They weren't going to change. But maybe, just maybe, she could change everything. She could finally make them see her. The thought took root slowly at first. It crept in quietly, like a snake slithering through the cracks of her mind. It was simple. She could make them feel what she had felt all these years. She could make them notice her, make them realize just how much they had neglected her. But it wasn't just about getting attention, it was about power. She had spent so long being overlooked, being ignored, that the thought of taking control, of having the power to make them all stop and listen, felt intoxicating. The anger that had been building for so long began to feel like something she could use. And in that moment, Hannah Williams made a decision, one that would change everything. In the heart of the Arizona desert, with nothing but the vast expanse of sand and rock around her, Hannah knew what she had to do. Her family would never see her, not unless she made them. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She wasn't going to be invisible. This time she would make them notice her. And when they did, it would be too late. The Arizona desert had always been a place of extremes, its beauty both terrifying and mesmerizing. To most people, it was a sprawling sea of endless sand dunes, jagged red rock formations, and vast open skies. A place where the sun beat down mercilessly by day, and the cold, unforgiving winds whispered haunting songs through the canyon walls at night. But to Hannah Williams, the desert felt like a vast, empty void, a perfect backdrop for the darkness growing inside her. Her family had chosen the isolated desert getaway as the location for their annual vacation, a week-long retreat meant to bring them closer together. But for Hannah, it felt less like a bonding experience and more like a prison. The house, nestled deep in the heart of the Arizona wilderness, was a sprawling modern cabin that stood out against the raw beauty of its surroundings. The exterior was made of rough-hewn stone, its surfaces weathered by years of sun and wind, giving it a hardened, almost unnatural appearance in the stark desert landscape. It had large windows that seemed to open up to the infinite stretches of dry earth and sharp cacti, but to Hannah they only served as a reminder of her isolation, of the emptiness around her, of the suffocating silence that seemed to grow deeper every day. The cabin was far from any town or village, its closest neighbor miles away, hidden beneath the haze of the shimmering heat that radiated from the earth. The nearest gas station was a 2-hour drive, and even the nearest park ranger station was unreachable, unless you knew the hidden back roads. It wasn't the sort of place where you could just walk out for a stroll or call a cab when you needed to get away. The isolation was absolute, the silence as thick as the dry desert air. The house was perched on a small hill, overlooking a wide expanse of cracked earth and boulder-strewn terrain. The landscape around it was harsh and unforgiving, the kind of environment where life had learned to survive by hardening itself against the elements. Tall, gnarled cacti dotted the land, their arms reaching upward like skeletal fingers, desperate for a touch of the sun. In the distance, jagged mountain ranges framed the horizon, their peaks dusted with the faintest hint of snow, a stark contrast to the scorching heat below. The ground, parched and cracked, seemed like a wound in the earth, left to fester in the open sun. The landscape stretched on in every direction, unbroken and barren, as though the world had forgotten it even existed. The house itself, designed for luxury but oddly out of place, had a modern, almost sterile feel. It was too large for a family of 5, too cold and impersonal to be truly inviting. Inside, the air smelled faintly of new wood and stale air conditioning. It had sleek, polished floors of dark hardwood, and heavy leather furniture arranged in a way that suggested it was meant to impress rather than make anyone feel comfortable. The walls were adorned with modern art that felt too perfect, too devoid of any real personality. The living room was spacious, with high ceilings that stretched up into shadows, making the space feel even emptier, like a cavern. The kitchen was a shiny, pristine area where Grace, her mother, always tried to create warmth and family meals, but the coldness of the house seemed to seep into every dish, every moment of togetherness. It was on the second day of their stay when the oppressive silence of the desert began to sink in deeper. The days were long and uncomfortably hot, the temperature rising into the triple digits before noon, making every inch of the cabin feel like a furnace. Despite the air conditioning inside, the heat outside seemed to creep through the walls like a slow-burning fever, pushing everyone further into their own corners. The landscape beyond the house felt like it was suffocating them all, as though the earth itself was pressing in on them, forcing them to confront the things they'd been avoiding. The emptiness outside mirrored the emptiness inside Hannah, and the stillness of the land mirrored the distance between her and the family she lived with, a family that seemed to be disintegrating under the weight of their own disconnectedness. In the mornings, the family would venture out on short hikes, trying to find something to do to occupy their time, but the scorching heat quickly drove them back indoors. Ethan, the older brother, would drag his feet in mock frustration, his loud voice carrying across the house, complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi or the lack of entertainment. Amanda, the rebellious older sister, would sulk in the corner of the cabin, her headphones in, pretending to ignore everyone. Grace would force smiles, trying to fill the house with cheer, even as her nerves began to fray. And Daniel, the father, would spend most of his time on the phone, handling work calls, trying to prove that he was somehow still connected to the world beyond this suffocating place. But it wasn't the outside that held Hannah's attention, it was the house itself, the desolate land beyond, and the weight of her own growing rage. She would sit in the quiet corners of the cabin, staring out the windows at the barren, unforgiving desert. There was something strange about the place, something that made her feel both unnervingly calm and unsettlingly exposed. The house was like a fortress, but the desert outside was like an open wound, a raw, unprotected expanse that stretched on for miles, offering nothing but space. It was in this empty place that her thoughts began to turn darker. The nights were the worst. The sun would finally dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the land. The temperature would drop suddenly and the cold desert air would seep into the house, sending chills through the walls. The wind would howl through the cracks, creating a ghostly chorus that rattled the windows. The silence of the day would give way to the strange noises of the desert night, an owl's hoot in the distance, the distant cry of a coyote, or the sound of something scraping against the ground. The isolation was even more apparent at night, as if the whole world had been swallowed by the desert, leaving only the family behind, like insects caught in a glass jar. Hannah would lie in her bed at night, the sheets twisted around her, listening to the wind outside, feeling a strange sense of calm. The desert had a way of making her feel like she was the only one left in the world, as though everything else, the noise, the demands, the expectations, had ceased to exist. In the darkness, she could hear her own thoughts clearly. The oppressive silence outside matched the silence she felt in her heart, the emptiness that had been growing inside her for so long. It was on one of these nights, when the moon hung low in the sky, casting a dim light over the desert, that something inside Hannah snapped. The weight of the silence outside, the crushing indifference of the landscape, and the years of being invisible to her family finally merged. The house, the desert, and everything it represented became a stage for her anger, a stage for her final act. The isolation, both physical and emotional, had allowed her to build a kind of dark clarity, an understanding of the power she could wield in this forgotten place. No one would hear their screams, no one would know what happened. The desert would swallow everything whole, just as it had swallowed her years of silence. She felt free in a way she had never felt before, as if the earth beneath her feet and the sky above her head had given her permission to make a choice that would break the chains of her own life. And so, in the suffocating stillness of the desert night, with the wind howling like a distant wail, Hannah made her decision. The land outside was barren and empty, and so was she. The family she had lived with, the family that had ignored her for so long, would never truly understand her unless she forced them to. The desert would remain silent. But for the first time in her life, Hannah felt like she could make the world listen. The first crack in the glass came quietly, like a whisper. It wasn't the kind of event that announced itself with grandeur, no dramatic confrontation or blazing row. It was a quiet, everyday moment, just like all the others in Hannah Williams' life. But in that moment, something inside her broke. The sharp edge of her anger, which had been simmering for so long, finally found its mark. It had been building for years of being overlooked, ignored, belittled, and it all boiled down to this one simple, seemingly insignificant moment. It was in the kitchen, a place she normally avoided. Her mother had been in there all morning, preparing breakfast, as she always did. Hannah had slipped in quietly, hoping to grab something to eat before her family descended upon the meal like a swarm of locusts, too eager to notice the quiet girl in the corner. Her mother was humming to herself, her back turned to Hannah as she sliced through the ripe fruits for the salad, her movements precise, careful, like she always did. It was a ritual, and it was part of what kept her tethered to the world she thought was perfect, the one where everything was supposed to be neat, clean, organized. Grace Williams had no room for chaos, for mess, for the unpredictability of a child who wasn't living up to the image of what she expected. And for Hannah, her mother's overbearing perfectionism felt like a prison. That morning, Grace had been talking again, prattling on about how they were all so blessed to be on this family trip. "This is exactly what we need," she'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Hannah hated that smile. It was the kind of smile that spoke volumes about her mother's constant need to push everything into neat little boxes, like how she would try to force a square peg into a round hole, all because she couldn't stand the messiness of life. "I just think this vacation is so important," Grace said as she turned, holding a plate of fruit slices in her hand. "We're going to reconnect as a family. I really hope you all take this seriously, Hannah. I want you to make the effort, okay?" Hannah froze. The words hit her like a slap across the face, but it wasn't just because her mother had spoken to her like she was some kind of problem to be solved. It was the way she always said things. The way she never really saw her. Never really acknowledged her. It was always about Ethan, always about Amanda, always about the idea of family being perfect and flawless, as if Hannah was just a shadow in the corner of their perfect little picture. The irony hit her like a ton of bricks. The idea of reconnecting as a family was laughable. They weren't reconnecting. They were just pretending to be something they weren't. "I try," Mom Hannah said in a soft voice, but her words were heavy with something darker. Her mother didn't hear it. Grace smiled warmly, but it was forced. "Good. I want to see that." That was the moment when the anger, which had been quietly waiting inside her, began to stir. It started small, a burning sensation in her chest, a tightness in her throat. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this way, but it felt different now. More intense, more dangerous. She was tired of it all. Tired of being the quiet one, the invisible one. Tired of watching everyone else get what they wanted while she remained in the background, unnoticed, unheard. Tired of the expectations her family piled on her shoulders, expectations she could never meet. Make the effort, her mother had said. But what about her? What about what she wanted? What about what she needed? She wanted them to see her. To acknowledge her. To stop pretending she was just a side note in their perfect little family narrative. "Mom, I don't think you get it," Hannah murmured under her breath. "What?" Grace asked, her voice bright with false cheer, thinking that Hannah was just being a difficult child. Hannah didn't answer at first. She just stared at the fruit slices in her mother's hand, at the way Grace moved so deliberately, so carefully. It made Hannah sick. She was so perfect, so put together, so untouchable. And yet she was the one who never truly saw her daughter. Her anger seethed in silence, boiling inside of her like a pressure cooker with the lid too tight. She could feel the tears rising behind her eyes, tears she refused to shed, because tears were for the weak, for those who couldn't control their emotions. No, she was beyond that now. She didn't need to cry. She didn't need to beg for attention. She needed something else, something more. Hannah's gaze drifted toward the knife on the counter, a long, thin blade with a gleaming silver edge. It was small enough to be inconspicuous, but sharp enough to cut through anything. It was a simple kitchen knife, one that her mother used every morning to prepare breakfast. And as her eyes lingered on it, something inside her shifted. The sharpness of the knife called to her, like a whisper in the back of her mind, a voice that grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't a voice of reason, nor was it a voice of compassion. It was the voice of something darker, something she had kept buried for so long. It was the voice of rage. She didn't reach for it, not yet, but the thought lingered, pressing against the walls of her mind like a heavy weight. What would happen if she finally acted on that impulse? What if just for once, she took control? What if she made them listen? What if she made them feel? Hannah Grace's voice broke through her thoughts. Are you even paying attention? I want you to try. This trip is about family. It's about bonding. Hannah didn't reply. Instead, she turned and walked away, feeling the weight of her mother's gaze pressing against her back. She wasn't trying to be rebellious. She wasn't trying to make a scene. But in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to feign interest. She was done with the charade. Done with pretending that everything was okay. She needed something else now. Something far darker. Later that night, as the family gathered around the large wooden table in the cabin's dining room, the same words continued to echo in her mind. Make the effort. Bond. Reconnect. All of it felt so suffocating, so empty. No one noticed how Hannah quietly withdrew from the conversation, how her fingers twisted nervously around the edge of her glass, how her eyes seemed to glaze over as her family continued to chat around her. It was all so ordinary, so meaningless. They talked about trivial things, the weather, the hikes, the food, but no one talked about anything that really mattered. Not the things that lived inside Hannah, not the rage that had been festering for so long, not the suffocating silence that had surrounded her for years. Ethan and Amanda argued, as they always did, about petty things: who had the better room, who got the bigger slice of cake. Their voices blended into a background hum, something familiar and insignificant. Grace smiled, tried to mediate, always the peacemaker, always striving for that perfect image of family harmony. And Daniel, as usual, was absorbed in his own world, his attention divided between his phone and the distant murmur of the conversation. No one noticed Hannah's expression change, the way her face hardened, the way her hands clenched beneath the table. They didn't see the spark of something dangerous flicker in her eyes. And in that moment, as the conversation continued to swirl around her like the wind outside, Hannah made a decision. It wasn't a choice born out of impulse or a sudden urge. It was something that had been building for a long time, a slow burn that had turned into an inferno. Her family would never understand. They would never notice her, not in the way she needed them to. They would never listen. And so, she would make them listen. She would make them see her. She would make them feel. They had pushed her to this point, ignored her for so long. And now, in the emptiness of the desert night, the trigger was pulled. As dusk fell over the Arizona desert, the night air grew thick with the tension that had been silently building throughout the day. The family had retreated to their isolated cabin after a long day of hiking and sightseeing, their laughter echoing in the empty spaces of the house, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The desert, with its unforgiving isolation, seemed to hold its breath, as if it too could feel the imminent danger approaching. Hannah sat at the edge of the table during dinner, barely aware of the conversation swirling around her. Her eyes glazed over as she poked at the food on her plate. Her parents, Daniel and Grace, were engaged in a lighthearted debate over the quality of the steaks they had grilled, while Ethan and Amanda argued about trivial matters: who had the better view from their respective rooms, who had eaten the most of the salad. The usual, empty noise. Hannah's hands, pale and trembling ever so slightly, rested on her lap. Her fingers flexed as if testing the grip she still held on reality. Inside, everything felt like it was coming undone. The resentment had been building for years, an undercurrent of bitterness woven into the fabric of their family life. She had tried so hard to be what they wanted her to be. She tried to fit into the image they had for her, to be the good daughter, the quiet one, the one who didn't make waves. But no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. Her father was always busy, her mother always too perfect to notice her struggles, and her siblings, well, they were too wrapped up in their own worlds to care about the one person who was suffocating in silence. Tonight, though, something was different. There was a crackling energy in the air, a weight pressing down on her chest that she couldn't shake. It was like something in her had snapped, and it wasn't just anger anymore. It was a deep, hollow feeling of abandonment, of being invisible, of being unloved. And the worst part? She knew they'd never understand. They'd never see her for who she truly was. No matter what she did, she'd always remain in the background, a shadow in their perfect little family. Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts, sweet and comforting, but hollow in Hannah's ears. "We're lucky to be here together, don't you think?" Grace said, smiling, a forced, shining smile that barely hid the exhaustion in her eyes. "It's important to have these family moments." Hannah looked up from her plate, her gaze cold and distant. "Lucky," she repeated, the the word tasting like acid on her tongue. You don't know what lucky is. No one heard her. Or maybe they simply ignored her. It was nothing new. Her father, oblivious as always, smiled and patted her shoulder. Come on, Hannah, it's not so bad. We're all together. That's what matters. Let's enjoy it. The weight inside her chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat. She felt trapped in this family, in this life, in this endless cycle of pretending that everything was fine when it was far from it. It was all just a game to them, wasn't it? A game of smiles and pretend happiness. And in that moment, she realized she didn't want to play anymore. Without thinking, her hand moved under the table. She could feel the cool, smooth edge of the knife that had been left there after the meal, its blade glinting in the low light from the overhead chandelier. It was just a regular kitchen knife, nothing special, nothing to make anyone think twice. But in her hand, it felt like the only thing she could control, the only thing that could give her the power she had long been denied. Her heart raced as she gripped it tighter, the pulse in her ears growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't about the knife. Not really. It wasn't even about the anger that burned through her veins like wildfire. It was about finally feeling something, anything. Finally having the courage to stop pretending, to stop living under the suffocating weight of her family's expectations. I'm done, she whispered to herself, barely audible over the chatter of her family. Her mother's laugh suddenly cut off, a small sound of confusion escaping her lips. She turned to Hannah, her brow furrowed with concern. What did you say, sweetheart? Hannah looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Grace's smile faltered, and for a moment, just a moment, Hannah could see the cracks in the mask her mother wore every day. But the illusion was quickly restored as Grace's face brightened once more, like a fresh coat of paint covering up the rot beneath. What's wrong, dear? Her mother asked, her tone now full of concern. But that too felt fake to Hannah. She didn't want concern. She didn't want pity. She wanted them to see her, to see the real her. Not the version they'd made up in their heads, but the one who had been buried under their perfect little world. I'm fine, Hannah said quietly, her fingers still clutching the knife. Just tired. She stood up slowly, almost deliberately, as the conversation continued around her. She felt the eyes of her family on her, but they didn't know. They never would. None of them could ever understand how it felt to be so utterly, completely invisible. She left the room, stepping into the darkness of the hallway. The sounds of the family dinner faded behind her, replaced by the low hum of her thoughts, her heart hammering in her chest. The desert night stretched out before her, silent and vast, just like the emptiness she felt inside. She didn't know where she was going, but she didn't care. The further she walked, the clearer the noise in her head became, the more urgent the need to do something, anything about it. Out in the desert, under the stars, Hannah came to a sudden stop. It was as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her, forcing her to make a choice. She knew what she had to do. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about freedom. The freedom that came with finally taking control of her own story, her own fate. No more pretending. No more silence. She turned around and walked back toward the cabin, her footsteps steady and certain. When she stepped back into the house, it was like a switch had been flipped. Her family, oblivious as ever, continued to talk and laugh. But for Hannah, everything had changed. She was no longer the invisible girl. She was the one with the power now. The knife felt heavier in her hand. It wasn't about what happened next, or what she would do with it. It was about the fact that for the first time in years, she was in control. And the terrifying truth was, she didn't know how far she was willing to go to keep that control. The desert air hung heavy with the stench of heat, mixing with the smell of dust and dried grass as the local authorities flooded into the remote cabin site. It had been hours since the horrific discovery was made, and the sun was beginning its descent over the Arizona horizon, casting long shadows across the crime scene. Sheriff Blake Morris was already on edge, feeling the weight of the situation press in on him. Something about the scene felt wrong, off-kilter. There was a strange quiet to the whole thing, a stillness that unnerved him. The first responders had already secured the perimeter, roping off the area with yellow crime scene tape, but Morris could see that they were struggling to make sense of what had happened. It wasn't just the bodies. They had found 5 of them sprawled in various rooms of the cabin, but the lack of answers, the absolute absence of a clear motive, was suffocating. And then there was Hannah, the 12-year-old girl, the lone survivor. When Morris had arrived, he'd been expecting a grisly scene, a chaotic mess of blood and violence. But what he hadn't been prepared for was the eerie calm that had settled over the place. It was as if the horror had been suspended in time, waiting for someone to peel back the layers. The house had been left undisturbed. Furniture was overturned, but there were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. It was like someone had planned it all, meticulously executed the murders, and then just stopped. Just stopped. They had found the girl in a corner of the living room, curled up in a fetal position, clutching her knees to her chest. She had been there for hours, seemingly in shock, her face blank, her eyes staring at nothing. When paramedics tried to approach her, she didn't move. They couldn't even get her to say anything, let alone tell them what had happened. They'd given her a blanket, a few sips of water, but the silence remained unbroken. The silence made Morris uneasy. The initial forensic team had been careful, their movements calculated. A few of the officers had taken pictures, cataloging the scene, while others checked for fingerprints or signs of any evidence that might point to a culprit. They didn't find much. No DNA traces, no hidden weapons, no clues that could directly implicate anyone. Only the faintest trace of something, a disturbed patch of dirt near the back door, as if someone had been hiding something. But the significance of it eluded them. Morris had seen murder before, of course. He'd seen the broken bodies, the blood-streaked walls, the senseless violence that tore families apart. But this felt different. Too controlled. Too deliberate. Like whoever had done this was playing a game. And the girl Hannah, she was the key. She was the only person who could explain the madness. The only person who could unravel what had truly happened. But how could someone so young, so innocent, be capable of such brutality? The investigation had started slowly. They'd brought in her family members for questioning, of course. But all they had were questions. No one had any answers. Hannah's mother, who had been unreachable since the incident, was practically in hysterics when the authorities reached her by phone. "My baby. My little girl," she kept repeating, as if in disbelief. Her husband, Mark, had immediately jumped in to try and calm her, but his voice was shaky, unsure. "We don't know anything," he had told the sheriff, standing beside his wife in their small, dimly lit living room. "Hannah, she's not herself. She doesn't understand. She couldn't have." The words trailed off, and Morris could see the fear in his eyes. It wasn't just concern for the girl anymore. It was fear of what she might have done. Fear of the realization that the child he'd raised could be responsible for the bloodshed. They had no answers from the parents. No one knew where she had gone after the murders. No one could say what had happened after dinner, the last time anyone had seen her before the massacre. The girl had been left alone. No signs of a struggle, no frantic phone calls, nothing. It was as if she had vanished into the desert, leaving only the bodies behind. Detective Carla Sanchez, a seasoned investigator who had worked her share of strange cases, was the first to suggest that maybe this wasn't just a simple family tragedy. The absence of any definitive motive made it clear someone had been hiding something. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. It wasn't random, not in the slightest. The killings were carefully planned, each death occurring in a separate room of the house, each victim caught off guard, each one left to die in their own space. There was no sign of struggle, no defensive wounds. Everything pointed to the fact that the killer had been calm, precise. And then, they had just stopped. They had no idea what to make of the way Hannah was acting, though. She wasn't what they had expected from a child who had just witnessed such brutality. There was no sobbing, no frantic attempts to get away. In fact, there was barely any sign that she understood the enormity of what had just happened. When the police first spoke to her, her responses had been eerily blank. "I didn't do it," she had said, her voice soft and hollow, like she was saying the words as much to herself as to them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when she began to talk about it. Not in the way you'd expect a traumatized child to speak, but with a strange, unsettling calm. There was no way out, she said at one point, her voice almost conversational. They were all fighting. And I told them. I told them they wouldn't listen. But they didn't hear me. So I made them hear me. I had to. The words sent a cold shiver down the back of Detective Sanchez's spine. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, something far darker. And it wasn't just one comment. It was a pattern of disturbing remarks that didn't fit the profile of a scared, innocent child. They tried to get her to explain further, but she just wouldn't say more. She wouldn't engage with anyone except to offer the occasional cryptic comment that only deepened the mystery. Hannah's refusal to break down her utter silence when it came to her family was more unnerving than any of the things she had said. The police questioned her, but each interview felt like a tug of war against a wall that didn't budge. Every response was too measured, too calculated. The eyes of a 12-year-old girl shouldn't have looked so cold, so empty. Yet every time they locked eyes with her, they could see the unsettling void. Days passed, but the questions remained. The investigation seemed to go in circles with no breakthrough. No evidence, no confessions, no nothing. The local authorities brought in experts, psychologists, and forensic specialists who all insisted that Hannah was hiding something, that her behavior was evidence of deeper psychological scars. But no one could figure out what had triggered her behavior. No one could put the pieces together. As the days wore on, and the search for answers intensified, the town itself began to whisper. What had happened to Hannah? What had driven her to do something so horrific? And who was going to pay the price for it? The story of a 12-year-old girl taking down her entire family in a fit of rage was a scandal too much for the quiet town to comprehend. The investigation was far from over, but everyone knew one thing for sure: this was a case that would haunt them for years to come. The truth, whatever it was still out there waiting to be uncovered, lurking in the dark corners of the desert. The aftermath of the massacre left the town in a state of uneasy silence, as if the desert itself had swallowed the truth. The once thriving community now felt like a ghost town, with whispers trailing in every corner, eyes glancing nervously at anyone who dared to speak. The family's cabin, abandoned and cordoned off by authorities, became a chilling monument to the horror that had unfolded. It was an eerie reminder of what had happened, the unspoken terror that still lingered in the air. As the weeks passed, the investigation seemed to stall. Forensic evidence had revealed little. No fingerprints, no blood trails to follow, no indication of anyone else having been involved. Hannah's cold silence persisted. She remained in protective custody, her mind a fortress that refused to yield. Psychiatrists and child psychologists were baffled by her lack of remorse or emotion. They couldn't reach her, couldn't understand the twisted logic behind her actions. It was as though the girl who had once been so full of life had become an entirely different person, someone dangerous and unreachable. The town's residents kept their distance, unable to fathom the darkness that had taken root in such a young girl. The local school held memorial services for the family, but there was an unspoken understanding that the true tragedy had only just begun. What had happened that night would never leave them, the questions echoing in every conversation. Hannah's fate remained uncertain. As her trial approached, leaving the town to reckon with the unspeakable horror and the chilling reality that evil could take root in the most innocent of places. The nightmare was far from over. Ethan Carter had always been the sort of man who faded into the background. At 30 years old, he had built a life in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. From the outside, his existence seemed nothing short of ordinary, even idyllic. A modest single-story home with a well-manicured lawn, a dependable used car parked in the driveway, and a respectable job as a high school science teacher, all pointed to someone who had followed the expected path of adulthood. To the neighbors who occasionally waved at him as he came and went, Ethan was a model resident, polite, reserved, and unremarkable in every way. But beneath the surface of this seemingly benign existence lay a mind that churned with resentment, alienation, and darkness. The neighborhood itself was the kind of place where nothing truly bad was supposed to happen. It was a small, tight-knit community of about 30 houses, all built in the late 1980s, with identical layouts and variations of beige and gray siding. The residents took pride in the illusion of togetherness, hosting block parties, sharing landscaping tips, and keeping an unspoken, but ever-present, competition over whose yard looked the most pristine. Children rode bicycles up and down the cul-de-sac, their laughter mingling with the hum of lawn mowers and the occasional bark of a dog. Parents congregated on porches in the evenings, wine glasses in hand, trading stories about their jobs and their children's school accomplishments. It was a picture of suburban comfort and camaraderie, a place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Ethan, however, had never quite fit into the social rhythm of the neighborhood. While others gathered for cookouts and holiday decorating contests, he preferred solitude. He never declined an invitation outright. He knew better than to draw attention to himself. But he always had an excuse ready: grading papers, attending teacher workshops, or simply being too tired from a long day at school were his go-to responses. In truth, Ethan loathed the forced smiles, the shallow conversations, and the intrusive questions about his personal life. He had no family to speak of, no partner, no children, and no close friends. This absence of attachments set him apart in a community where family life was the cornerstone of social interaction. Though no one said it outright, Ethan could sense the unease his solitary existence evoked in others. They didn't trust what they couldn't understand, and a single man with no apparent desire to build the conventional life they all cherished was, in their eyes, an anomaly. Ethan's students knew him as Mr. Carter, a competent, if slightly stern teacher who rarely deviated from the curriculum. He wasn't the kind of teacher who inspired lifelong admiration or deep affection, but he also wasn't the kind who garnered complaints. He arrived on time, delivered his lessons with precision, and maintained order in his classroom. His colleagues respected his professionalism, but often found him aloof. Dr. Evans was determined to focus on medical school, and he was an achieved rock star. He never joined the staff for happy hours or contributed much to faculty meetings beyond the bare minimum. In the controlled environment of his classroom, Ethan felt safe. The lab equipment, the chemical formulas, and the rigid structure of the academic calendar provided him with a sense of order that the outside world seemed to lack. But outside the classroom, in the quiet moments of his own home, Ethan's mind was anything but orderly. His thoughts often drifted to the neighbors who surrounded him, their lives so different from his own. He watched them from his living room window as they walked their dogs or chatted on the sidewalk, their laughter grating against his ears. To him, they were actors in a play, their smiles rehearsed, their conversations scripted, their lives empty of genuine meaning. He saw through the facades of friendliness and community spirit, perceiving instead a web of hypocrisy, judgment, and superficiality. Over time, this perception hardened into a simmering resentment, a deep-seated anger that he struggled to contain. Ethan had never been particularly close to anyone, even as a child. Raised by a single mother who worked long hours as a nurse, he spent much of his youth alone, reading books and tinkering with science experiments in his room. He had always been intelligent, but his intelligence often isolated him from his peers, who found him odd and difficult to relate to. In high school, he was the quiet kid who sat in the back of the class, avoided eye contact, and excelled academically but was never invited to parties or included in group activities. The few friendships he did manage to form were short-lived, as his intensity and inability to connect emotionally often drove people away. Over time, he grew accustomed to being alone, convincing himself that he didn't need anyone and that the world was better observed from a distance. The neighborhood, with its cliques and its unspoken rules of social engagement, felt like a microcosm of the world that had always rejected him. The families who lived there saw themselves as inclusive and welcoming, but Ethan knew better. He noticed the way their smiles faltered when they spoke to him, the way their eyes darted around uncomfortably when he offered a polite comment. He heard the whispers that followed him when he turned his back, the subtle mockery disguised as concern. "Be so quiet," they would say. "You never really know what's going on with someone like that." Over time, these small slights accumulated like drops of acid, eroding what little goodwill Ethan might have once felt toward his neighbors. There was one family in particular that seemed to embody everything Ethan despised about the neighborhood: the Robinsons. With their perfectly coordinated holiday decorations, their golden retriever named Max, and their weekly brunches that spilled onto the front lawn, they were the epitome of suburban perfection. Alan Robinson, the patriarch, was a real estate agent with a booming voice and a handshake that lasted just a beat too long. His wife Linda was a stay-at-home mom who organized the neighborhood's events with an efficiency that bordered on militaristic. Their two teenage daughters, Madison and Chloe, were blonde, beautiful, and popular, the kind of girls who seemed to glide through life without ever encountering a single hardship. To Ethan, the Robinsons were the very definition of artificiality, a family that wore its happiness like a mask to hide the rot beneath. Enough is Ethan's resentment toward the Robinsons and the rest of the neighborhood grew with each passing year. He began to see their actions not just as annoyances, but as personal affronts, deliberate attempts to exclude and belittle him. Every laugh, every whispered conversation, every sidelong glance felt like an attack. He started keeping a journal, pouring his frustrations onto the pages in jagged, angry handwriting. At first, his entries were vague and abstract, musings on the nature of society and the human condition. But as time went on, they became more specific, more focused, and more disturbing. He began cataloging the behaviors of his neighbors, noting their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. It was an outlet, a way to process his emotions. But it also marked the beginning of a dark transformation. In his mind, Ethan began to see himself as a victim of a world that had always misunderstood and mistreated him. His neighbors, with their smiles and their handshakes and their insipid conversations, became the embodiment of everything he hated about society. They were the reason he felt so isolated, so angry, so broken. And as that anger festered, it began to demand an outlet, a release. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the quiet life he had built for himself in that small suburban neighborhood was about to shatter in ways that no one, least of all his unsuspecting neighbors, could have ever imagined. Ethan Carter's life had always been a precarious balance between restraint and the storm of emotions simmering beneath the surface. For years, he had carefully maintained his quiet, detached existence, letting his resentment toward the neighbors grow in the shadows of his mind. It had been manageable, something he could confine to the pages of his journal and the confines of his thoughts. But as the years went on, small, seemingly insignificant moments began to build on each other, like grains of sand accumulating to form a mountain. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It was the culmination of countless slights, whispers, and moments of exclusion that finally pushed Ethan over the edge. The catalyst arrived on a warm summer evening in June, a day that began like any other, but would mark the start of a transformation that no one could have foreseen. Ethan had spent most of the day indoors, grading papers and avoiding the oppressive heat outside. As the sun began to set, painting the set in hues of orange and purple, the familiar sounds of neighborhood life drifted through his open windows. Laughter, music, and the unmistakable sizzle of a grill reached his ears. He glanced outside and immediately felt his stomach twist. The Robinsons were hosting one of their infamous barbecues, and as usual, the entire neighborhood seemed to be in attendance. Ethan watched from behind his curtains, his gaze fixed on the crowd gathered in the Robinsons' backyard. There were familiar faces everywhere. Alan Robinson with his booming laughter, Linda gracefully flitting between groups of guests, and their daughters, Madison and Chloe, chatting with friends by the pool. Ethan's other neighbors were there too, mingling, eating, and drinking, as though they were all part of some exclusive club he could never hope to join. He saw the couples he occasionally waved to in passing, the children who played in the street, the retired couple who always pruned their rose bushes with military precision. They were all there, smiling, laughing, and sharing, in a sense of camaraderie that had never been extended to him. As he stood there, hidden in the shadows of his living room, Ethan felt a familiar bitterness rise in his chest. He had never been invited to one of these barbecues, not once, in all the years he had lived in the neighborhood. He told himself he wouldn't have gone even if he had been invited. He hated those kinds of gatherings. But the exclusion still stung. It was a reminder of how little he mattered to the people around him, how easily they dismissed him as an outsider. He was a ghost in their lives, visible but not truly seen, existing on the periphery of their world. It wasn't just the party itself that bothered him, though. What truly ignited the fire inside him was what he overheard later that night. As the barbecue wound down and the guests began to leave, Ethan stepped outside, under the cover of darkness, to take out his trash. The air was still warm, and the smell of grilled meat lingered in the breeze. He kept his head down as he walked to the curb, not wanting to risk running into any of his neighbors. But as he turned to head back to his house, he heard voices, faint at first, but growing louder as he listened. He realized the voices were coming from the Robinsons' backyard, where a small group of guests had stayed behind, lingering over drinks and casual conversation. At first, the words were indistinct, just the murmur of idle chatter, but then he heard his name. His heart stopped, and he froze in place, straining to hear. The group wasn't speaking loudly, but the quiet night carried their voices, just far enough for Ethan to make out the gist of their conversation. "They're talking about me," he thought, his chest tightening. He caught snippets of their words, phrases like, "weird guy," "never see him with anyone," and "kind of creepy." Someone laughed, and another voice chimed in, saying something about how Ethan always seemed to be watching people, how he gave off an unsettling vibe. They weren't yelling, weren't even particularly cruel in their tone, but the words cut deeper than any insult could have. To Ethan, it wasn't just gossip. It was confirmation of everything he had suspected about how his neighbors saw him. They didn't respect him. They didn't like him. They didn't even view him as a real person, just some strange, lonely man who didn't belong. Ethan hurried back inside, his heart pounding and his hands trembling. He didn't turn on any lights, choosing instead to sit in the dark, his mind racing. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that he didn't care what they thought of him. But the words echoed in his head, each one a dagger that drove deeper into his psyche. Creepy, weird, unsettling. He had spent his entire life trying to blend in, to avoid drawing attention, to simply exist without judgment. And yet, here he was, the subject of ridicule and suspicion, in the very community where he had tried to find peace. The final blow came the next morning when Ethan checked his mailbox and found an anonymous letter. It was written on plain white paper, the words printed in neat, blocky handwriting. The note was brief but devastating. "You're not fooling anyone. We know what you really are." There was no signature, no indication of who might have sent it. Ethan read the note over and over, his mind spinning with paranoia. Who had written it? How many of his neighbors had seen it before it was delivered? What did they think they knew about him? The letter felt like an accusation, a threat, a declaration of war. It confirmed his worst fears. The neighborhood wasn't just indifferent to him. They were watching him, judging him, conspiring against him. Ethan spent the rest of the day in a haze, his thoughts consumed by the note and the voices he had overheard. He tried to focus on his work, grading assignments and preparing lesson plans, but he couldn't escape the sense of betrayal that gnawed at him. The people he had lived among for years, the people he had tried to coexist with, had turned on him. They had stripped away the last shred of dignity he had, leaving him exposed and humiliated. That night, as he sat alone in his darkened house, Ethan felt something inside him snap. It was a quiet breaking, not a dramatic outburst or a moment of clarity, but a subtle shift in his mind. The resentment he had carried for so long began to crystallize into something sharper, something colder. He realized he couldn't live like this anymore. Couldn't tolerate the sneers and whispers and judgment. If the neighborhood saw him as a threat, then perhaps it was time to become one. The first murder was not born out of impulse, but out of cold calculation. Ethan Carter had always prided himself on his methodical nature, and when he decided to cross the threshold from thought to action, he knew there could be no mistakes. He was not an impulsive man, nor one prone to outbursts of violence. For Ethan, this was not about rage, it was about justice. His own warped version of it. His neighbors had painted him as the villain, the outsider, the odd man who didn't belong. They had laughed at him, whispered about him, reduced him to a shadow in their perfect little world. Now, they would learn the consequences of their cruelty, and Ethan would ensure that they suffered for it, one by one. Ethan began by observing his neighbors more closely than ever before, his anger sharpening his focus into something almost predatory. He had always been a keen observer, cataloging their movements and habits from behind his curtains, but now he watched them with purpose. He noted who came home at what time, who left their windows unlocked, who spent time in their backyards after dark. What about this? Who was splitting the patio wood? He'd asked him in the bookstore once, who was splitting the patio wood. Every detail was committed to memory, recorded in his journal, where the innocuous routine of suburban life was transformed into a meticulous ledger of opportunity. He didn't rush. Weeks passed as he refined his understanding of his targets. Patience was a skill he had mastered long ago, and now it became his most powerful weapon. The first target was Cheryl Whitaker, a woman in her late 50s who lived alone 2 houses down from Ethan. She had been one of the voices he had overheard during the Robinsons' barbecue, the one who had laughed and called him subtling. Cheryl was a creature of habit, her days governed by a rigid schedule. Every evening at precisely 9:30, she would take her dog for a walk around the block, returning home by 9:50. The dog was small and elderly, its pace slow and predictable. Ethan knew her route, knew the way she lingered on the sidewalk in front of her house to check her mailbox before going inside. She was the perfect starting point, accessible, predictable, and, most importantly, alone. Ethan spent several nights rehearsing the murder in his mind, playing out every possible scenario to ensure there would be no errors. He knew that Cheryl's house had a motion-activated security light above the front door, but it didn't extend to the side gate that led to her backyard. Her dog, while noisy during the day, was nearly deaf and almost never barked after sunset. Cheryl herself was complacent, her suburban life lulling her into a false sense of safety. Ethan decided that poison would be his method of choice. It was clean, quiet, and, when executed correctly, would leave no immediate trace of foul play. As a science teacher, Ethan had access to chemicals that, when combined, could create a lethal toxin. He prepared a solution in his home laboratory, carefully measuring the ingredients with the same precision he had taught his students in the classroom. The poison was odorless and tasteless, designed to mimic a sudden heart attack. Ethan tested small doses on stray animals he trapped in his backyard, ensuring its potency before committing to the act. The preparation was meticulous, almost ritualistic, and with each step, Ethan felt a growing sense of control over his life. On the night of the murder, Ethan waited until 9:20 before slipping out of his house, a syringe of the poison tucked into his jacket pocket. He wore dark clothing and gloves, his face obscured by a black baseball cap. The air was warm and still, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. From the shadows of his yard, he watched Cheryl emerge from her house with her dog, her movements as predictable as clockwork. She didn't notice him, as he followed at a distance, his footsteps silent on the pavement. When Cheryl returned to her front yard at 9:50, Ethan was ready. He waited until she crouched to check her mailbox, her back to him, before he approached. The syringe slid from his pocket into his hand with practiced ease. In a matter of seconds, he closed the distance between them and injected the poison into her neck, his movements swift and precise. Cheryl gasped, her body stiffening as the toxin took effect, and within moments, she collapsed onto the grass. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her gently to avoid any visible injuries. Her dog, oblivious, tugged at its leash, its clouded eyes unaware of what had just transpired. Ethan worked quickly, dragging Cheryl's body into her backyard, where it would remain out of sight until morning. He arranged her as if she had simply collapsed on her patio, her hand resting near an overturned glass of water he had placed there to reinforce the illusion of natural causes. The entire act took less than 10 minutes, and by the time he returned to his house, his pulse had already slowed to its usual steady rhythm. He disposed of the syringe and gloves in a plastic bag, which he later burned in a fire pit in his backyard. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with the news of Cheryl's death. The paramedics arrived first, followed by the police, who spent less than an hour on the scene before concluding it had been a heart attack. The absence of any visible injuries or signs of foul play made it an open and shut case. Ethan watched from his window as the coroner's van drove away, a faint sense of satisfaction washing over him. He had done it. He had taken control, and no one suspected a thing. The success of the first murder emboldened Ethan, fueling his resolve to continue. Over the following weeks, he selected his next targets with the same meticulous care, each one chosen for their role in his growing narrative of revenge. He varied his methods to avoid detection, tampering with medications, cutting brake lines, even staging a fall down a... Each death was made to look like a tragic accident or an unfortunate twist of fate, and each one brought Ethan a step closer to the justice he believed he was delivering. As the body count grew, so did the tension in the neighborhood. Fear began to replace the easy camaraderie that had once defined the community. Ethan watched as his neighbors grew more paranoid, locking their doors and looking over their shoulders. They didn't know who to trust, and in their confusion, they never once suspected the quiet, unassuming man who lived among them. Ethan took pleasure in their fear, seeing it as a form of poetic justice. They had cast him as an outsider, a threat, and now he had become exactly that. But as methodical as Ethan was, the cracks in his plan were beginning to form. Each murder brought with it new risks, new variables he couldn't always control. And while the authorities remained oblivious for now, Ethan knew that no plan, no matter how carefully crafted, could remain flawless forever. Still, he pressed on, driven by the conviction that what he was doing was not just revenge, but a necessary correction to the world that had wronged him. In his mind, he was no longer just a man. He was an arbiter, a force of reckoning, and the neighborhood would never be the same again. Ethan Carter's first murders were clinical, methodical, and devoid of any emotion beyond cold determination. But as the body count rose, the orderly precision of his actions began to give way to something darker, more chaotic, and deeply personal. In the beginning, Ethan approached his plan with the same careful attention to detail that he applied to his lesson plans and experiments in the classroom. Each death was calculated, executed with precision, and designed to appear as an unfortunate accident or natural cause. But as he began to unravel under the weight of his own actions, the murders became more erratic, more brazen, and far less controlled. What had begun as a coldly rational campaign of vengeance against his neighbors transformed into a violent descent into madness. After the first few murders, Ethan found himself obsessed with the aftermath. He would sit by his window, watching the commotion as paramedics and police arrived at the homes of his victims. He observed the shock and grief of the neighborhood with a detached sense of satisfaction, noting how they clung to each other in fear, their perfect suburban facade beginning to crack. He read every news article about the deaths, scouring them for details that might link him to the crimes. At first, the reports only strengthened his confidence. The coroner ruled the first death, a middle-aged man named Richard Porter who lived 2 houses down from Ethan, as a heart attack. The second victim, an elderly woman named Dolores, who had always complained about Ethan's unkempt hedges, was believed to have fallen in her kitchen and hit her head. Ethan had tampered with her kitchen tiles just days before. To the outside world, these were tragic but explainable deaths. To Ethan, they were proof of his genius. But as he carried out more killings, the carefully crafted mask he wore began to slip. He started to relish the planning stages of his crimes more than the execution, poring over his notes late into the night as he plotted his next move. Each new target became an obsession. He began keeping trophies from his victims, small, seemingly insignificant items like a button, a pen, or a scrap of paper. Things he could hide easily, but that held a perverse meaning for him. These objects became symbols of his power over the people who had once belittled and excluded him, tangible proof that he was no longer the invisible, unimportant man they thought he was. But the murders didn't bring him the peace or closure he had imagined. Instead, they fed a growing paranoia that began to consume him. The more bodies he left in his wake, the more he became convinced that someone would eventually figure out what he was doing. Every knock at the door, every stray glance from a neighbor, every passing police car sent his heart racing. He started seeing patterns where none existed, interpreting innocent actions as signs that the walls were closing in on him. A package left on his porch was, in his mind, a warning. A casual wave from a neighbor was a veiled accusation. The paranoia ate away at him, making him jumpy and irritable, even when he was alone. The police presence in the neighborhood intensified after the third and fourth murders. While no direct connection had been made between the deaths, the sheer number of tragedies occurring in such a small area raised eyebrows. Patrol cars began making regular rounds, and detectives were seen canvassing the neighborhood, asking questions that made Ethan's stomach twist into knots. At night, Ethan would pace the length of his small house, replaying every detail of his interactions with the police in his head, scrutinizing his own behavior for anything that might have seemed suspicious. He knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake. But his nerves were fraying, and the cracks in his composure were becoming harder to conceal. His paranoia soon began to bleed into his actions, and his murders grew more violent and impulsive. The careful planning that had defined his earlier crimes gave way to sudden bursts of rage that he could barely control. One night, in a fit of anger, He strangled Alan Robinson, the boisterous real estate agent who had been one of the loudest voices of gossip about Ethan. That's when his rage began to flood him, and after stumping, he grabbed Ethan. It wasn't part of his plan. Alan hadn't even been on his list of immediate targets, but the sight of the man laughing with friends at his doorstep triggered something primal in Ethan. The murder was sloppy, rushed, and filled with mistakes. Ethan barely managed to clean up the evidence, and for days afterward, he was convinced that the police would show up at his door with handcuffs in hand. When they didn't, his fear turned into an almost manic sense of invincibility. He began to believe that he was untouchable, that his neighbors were too blind, too naive to see the monster living among them. But that invincibility came at a cost. The murders were no longer about vengeance or justice in Ethan's mind. They became an outlet for the chaos and anger that had been building within him for years. He started leaving behind subtle clues, almost daring the police to catch him. At one crime scene, he arranged a stack of books to spell out his victim's initials. At another, he carved a small, nearly imperceptible symbol into the wooden banister of the staircase. These acts were his way of asserting control, of proving that he was smarter than anyone who might come after him. But they were also signs of his unraveling, evidence of a mind that was no longer operating with the cold logic that had once defined him. Ethan's physical appearance began to deteriorate along with his mental state. He stopped shaving, stopped maintaining the clean-cut image that had allowed him to blend in so seamlessly. His once pristine home became a chaotic mess of papers, books, and the trophies he had collected from his victims. He rarely slept, his nights consumed by the constant hum of his overactive mind. Purcell was increasingly consumed with the hum of his overactive mind. The boundaries between his two lives, the quiet, unassuming teacher and the meticulous killer, blurred, until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. By the time Ethan claimed his 15th victim, the neighborhood was in a state of absolute panic. The once cheerful streets were now filled with fear and suspicion. Neighbors stopped talking to each other, their sense of community shattered by the invisible threat that loomed over them. Security cameras appeared on front porches, locks were changed, and children were kept indoors after dark. He pretty much did whatever he felt like in a village at this point. Ethan reveled in the chaos he had created, but even as he watched the neighborhood unravel, a part of him felt hollow. The satisfaction he had once derived from his actions was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of emptiness and despair. The murders no longer gave him the sense of power he craved. They were simply a compulsion, a grim routine that he couldn't stop, even if he wanted to. Ethan's descent into madness was complete, but he was too far gone to see it. To him, the world had always been broken, filled with people who deserved the pain he inflicted upon them. What he didn't realize was that the walls were indeed closing in, and the chaos he had unleashed was not just consuming the neighborhood, it was consuming him as well. Ethan chafed his bed. He waited and waited until his feet hurt, but he was not allowed out of bed. Once daylight returned, the beginning of the end for Ethan Carter came on a cold, overcast evening in late November. The neighborhood, once vibrant with chatter and life, had become a shadow of its former self. Curtains were drawn tight against the outside world. Houses sat in eerie silence, and the streets were empty long before the sun dipped below the horizon. Fear had woven itself into the fabric of the community, choking it of its usual cheer. Ethan watched it all with a mixture of satisfaction and weariness, his mind clouded by the toll of his own actions. He had achieved what he thought he wanted: control, dominance, a kind of twisted revenge. But it hadn't filled the void inside him. If anything, it had grown wider, darker, and more suffocating. And now, despite all his precautions, it was starting to collapse. The unraveling began with his 17th victim, Diane Fletcher, a reclusive widow who lived at the far end of the cul-de-sac. She had never been part of the gossiping circles that Ethan despised, nor had she ever openly disrespected him. But in Ethan's mind, her quiet presence made her complicit. She had watched, just like the others, never once extending a hand or a kind word. In the warped logic of his spiraling mind, this was enough to condemn her. He decided to act impulsively, without the meticulous planning that had characterized his earlier murders. It would be quick, he told himself, a way to silence the nagging voices in his head that told him he was losing his edge. Under the cover of night, Ethan crept into Diane's home. He had become so accustomed to the act of killing that he barely felt the tension he once had. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but as he worked to stage the scene of her death, a supposed fall down the stairs, his carelessness betrayed him. In his haste, he left behind a single thread from his jacket, caught on a splinter of wood at the base of the staircase. He took the thread. He snagged the edge to keep it from looping it over the bottom. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The next morning, Diane's body was discovered by a neighbor delivering groceries to her doorstep. This time, the police didn't dismiss the death as a tragic accident. The accumulating pattern of unexplained deaths in the neighborhood, coupled with the piece of evidence Ethan had overlooked, finally set the wheels of justice into motion. The police presence in the neighborhood swelled overnight. Crime scene tapes surrounded Diane's house, and detectives worked tirelessly to comb through every inch of it for clues. The thread was analyzed, and it didn't take long for forensic experts to determine that it came from a unique blend of fibers, not commonly found in most clothing. It was the first concrete lead they had in months. Ethan, unaware of the mistake he had made, watched the commotion from his window with a sinking feeling in his chest. Something about the way the police moved, their urgency, told him that this wasn't like the other deaths. They were closing in, and for the first time, he felt a sharp pang of genuine fear. Ethan tried to maintain his composure, but paranoia consumed him. He stopped going to work, calling in sick with vague excuses that didn't convince anyone. His once immaculate home had become a chaotic den of paranoia, with newspaper clippings, maps, and scribbled notes covering every available surface. He rarely slept, jumping at every sound, convinced that the police would come for him at any moment. His carefully constructed facade of normalcy had disintegrated entirely. The neighbors who once avoided him out of indifference now avoided him out of fear, their eyes lingering on his house with suspicion whenever they dared venture outside. The final blow came when the police obtained a warrant to search his home. Ethan had anticipated this, but not quickly enough. He had tried to destroy the evidence, burning his journals, discarding his trophies, scrubbing every surface of his house. But he couldn't erase everything. In his panic, he overlooked the smallest details: a partial fingerprint on a pair of gloves he had forgotten to discard, traces of chemicals he had used in his earlier murders, and the torn page of a journal that had slipped under his bed. These fragments of his life, insignificant on their own, came together to form a damning picture of guilt. When the officers arrived at his door, Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he barricaded himself inside, locking every door and window. From his living room, he could hear the muffled voices of the officers as they announced their presence, followed by the sharp knock of a battering ram against his front door. Panic surged through him, and for a moment he considered making a run for it. But there was nowhere to go. The house was surrounded, and he knew he wouldn't make it far. Instead, he retreated to his bedroom, clutching the last journal he hadn't destroyed, the pages filled with his manifesto, a rambling, incoherent explanation of why he had done what he had done. The standoff lasted hours. Negotiators tried to coax him out, offering promises of safety and a fair trial, but Ethan knew better. He knew that his life as he had known it was over. The perfect crime he had envisioned had crumbled under the weight of his own mistakes. He paced the room, clutching the journal, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He thought about ending it all, taking the final act of control before the world could take it from him. But in the end, his desire to explain himself, to make the world understand his reasons, won out. When Ethan finally emerged from the house, it was with his hands raised and his face streaked with tears. The neighbors who had gathered at a safe distance watched in stunned silence as the man who had terrorized their community for months was led away in handcuffs. To them, Ethan was a monster, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in their once idyllic neighborhood. But to Ethan, he was something else. A man who had been wronged, misunderstood, and pushed to the brink. Even as he was loaded into the back of a police car, he clung to the belief that he had been justified, that his actions had meaning. The trial that followed was a media spectacle, with every gruesome detail of Ethan's crimes laid bare for the world to see. Prosecutors painted him as a cold, calculating killer, while his defense team argued that he was a man broken by years of isolation and mental illness. Ethan himself remained eerily calm throughout the proceedings, occasionally glancing at the gallery where his former neighbors sat, their faces pale with shock and anger. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, he didn't react. He simply stared ahead, his expression unreadable, as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the months that followed, the neighborhood tried to rebuild, but the scars left by Ethan's actions ran deep. His house, once a nondescript part of the cul-de-sac, became a chilling reminder of what had happened there. Some neighbors moved away, unable to bear the memories. Others stayed, determined to reclaim the sense of safety they had lost. But none of them would ever forget the quiet teacher who had lived among them, hiding a darkness they had never suspected until it was too late. For Ethan, the story wasn't over. In the confines of his prison cell, he began writing his manifesto anew, convinced that someday someone would read his words and understand the mind of the man who had brought a small Ohio neighborhood to its knees. The aftermath of Ethan Carter's arrest rippled through the neighborhood like the aftershocks of an earthquake. In the immediate days following his capture, the once quiet cul-de-sac became a flurry of activity. News vans lined the streets, their bright lights and relentless cameras capturing every angle of the house that had been the epicenter of such unimaginable horror. Reporters hounded the remaining residents, demanding sound bites about what it was like to live next door to a serial killer. The neighbors, most of whom had once prided themselves on their sense of community, found themselves overwhelmed by the attention, struggling to reconcile the idyllic lives they had built with the nightmare they were now forced to confront. Ethan's house quickly became a grotesque monument to his crimes. Police tapes surrounded the property for weeks as investigators continued to search for every scrap of evidence that might explain his descent into violence. Forensic teams moved in and out of the home, carrying boxes filled with the macabre artifacts of Ethan's double life. The journals, the trophies, the carefully crafted notes about each murder. These items painted a chilling picture of a man who had meticulously plotted the deaths of those he had lived alongside for years. The revelations only deepened the horror. The neighbors struggled to understand how someone they had seen almost daily, someone who had taught their children, could harbor such hatred for them. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood fractured under the weight of the trauma. Families who had lived there for decades began to sell their homes, unable to endure the lingering sense of dread that came with staying. The once pristine lawns grew overgrown, as the remaining residents no longer had the energy or desire to maintain the image of perfection they had once cultivated so carefully. Those who stayed rarely spoke to one another, their trust in their community forever broken. If someone like Ethan Carter could live among them undetected, they reasoned, then anyone could. For the Robinsons, who had been at the center of Ethan's resentment, the ordeal was particularly harrowing. Alan Robinson's murder had been one of Ethan's most brutal and unplanned acts, and Linda Robinson struggled to move on without her husband. She and her daughters eventually left the neighborhood altogether, their house sitting empty for months before a real estate company purchased it and quietly sold it to an out-of-town buyer. For the Robinson family, every creak of the floorboards and every shadow cast by the streetlights had become a haunting reminder of what they had lost. Ethan's trial and subsequent sentencing dominated headlines for months. Psychologists, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts all weighed in, speculating about what had driven him to kill. Was it his loneliness, his paranoia, a deep-seated mental illness? In interviews, former colleagues described him as competent but distant, while his students recalled a teacher who had always seemed disconnected, as though he were never truly present in the classroom. Some argued that the neighborhood's coldness and exclusion had pushed him to the brink, while others dismissed this as an excuse for his cruelty. Ethan himself remained an enigma. Though his manifesto was dissected and analyzed, it offered no real answers, only ramblings about betrayal, justice, and a desire to expose the hypocrisy of those around him. In the end, Ethan's motives remained as incomprehensible as the murders themselves. The upper limit, the broader public was captivated by the case, and as always happens in the wake of such horrors, it didn't take long for the internet to seize upon Ethan Carter's story. Conspiracy theories sprouted like weeds, with amateur sleuths scouring news reports and court documents for details that might have been overlooked. Some viewed Ethan as a monster, pure and simple, while others painted him as a tragic figure, a product of a broken society that had failed to see his pain until it was too late. Disturbingly, a small but vocal minority of online followers began to idolize him, calling him a misunderstood genius or even a vigilante. His manifesto, which he had hoped would justify his actions, instead became a rallying point for those drawn to his darkness. It was a final, twisted legacy for a man who had caused so much pain. As time passed, the neighborhood slowly began to fade from the public eye. The police tape was removed, the news vans packed up, and the world moved on to the next tragedy. But for those who had lived there, the scars remained. The laughter of children no longer echoed through the streets, and block parties became a thing of the past. The once vibrant community was now little more than a collection of houses, its residents bound together not by friendship or camaraderie, but by the shared trauma of having lived alongside a killer. Though the fear eventually subsided, the sense of loss never truly disappeared. Ethan Carter's crimes had hollowed out the neighborhood, leaving behind only silence, suspicion, and the memory of what had been. Layla Harris sat hunched over her desk, the fluorescent lights above casting a cold, clinical glow on her pale features. The marketing firm in downtown Cleveland buzzed with the low hum of office chatter, the clicking of keyboards, and the occasional laugh that erupted from small clusters of coworkers. Layla never joined those conversations, never stood by the water cooler to gossip or share weekend plans. At just 21 years old, she was the youngest employee in the company, fresh out of college with dreams of making her mark. But those dreams had soured quickly. Her colleagues called her a ghost behind her back, a shadow that drifted in and out of the office without a sound. Some said she was standoffish, others claimed she was strange. Layla didn't care what they thought. She had learned long ago that trust was a dangerous thing, a lesson burned into her memory by years of betrayal. At home, her childhood had been a battlefield, marked by her father's drunken rages and her mother's empty promises to leave him. That chaos had shaped her into someone who watched, who waited, who learned to hide the seething storm beneath her calm surface. The isolation at work didn't bother her at first. She preferred solitude, where her thoughts could flow uninterrupted. But it wasn't long before the cracks in her coworkers' smiles began to show. The whispers started small, a snide comment about her thrift store outfits, a joke about her silence during team meetings. Layla ignored it, telling herself that it didn't matter. But the whispers grew louder, more cutting. "She's probably a weirdo who lives with her mom," she heard one coworker sneer during lunch. Another chimed in, laughing, "Bet she's one of those crazy loners you see on the news." The cruelty of their words festered in her mind, planting seeds of resentment. Layla worked harder than anyone else, staying late to perfect presentations and triple check numbers. But no one noticed. Instead, they saw her as an easy target, someone to blame when things went wrong. The first time her manager, Christine Blake, singled her out in a meeting, Layla's stomach twisted with humiliation. Christine's voice was syrupy sweet, but the barb in her words was sharp enough to draw blood. "We all need to pull our weight," Christine said, her gaze settling on Layla. "Some of us seem to think that staying quiet means we can avoid accountability." The room erupted in polite laughter, and Layla burned with shame. It wasn't just Christine. Her colleagues joined in, feeding off her vulnerability like sharks scenting blood in the water. They made sure she heard their jokes, their cruel little jabs disguised as office banter. Once she returned from the bathroom to find her computer desktop filled with dozens of open tabs on dating websites, a crude prank that sent a wave of laughter through the room. She deleted them silently, her hands trembling as she fought to keep her composure. But the breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Layla had stayed late the night before, finishing a campaign proposal that Christine had been too busy to complete. She handed it in with quiet pride, hoping it might earn her some recognition. Instead, she watched in stunned silence as Christine presented the work as her own during a meeting, accepting compliments with a smile that made Layla's stomach churn. When she tried to speak up, Christine cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Let's stay focused, Layla. We're not here for petty grievances." Something inside Layla snapped that day. She felt it, a crack deep in her core, like a fault line shifting beneath the surface. She stopped feeling humiliated and started feeling cold, calculating. That night, as the rain lashed against her apartment window, she sat in the dark and stared at her reflection. Her eyes, once soft and hopeful, were now hard and unblinking. She thought of Christine, of the laughter, of the way her colleagues had stolen every ounce of dignity she had left. Her thoughts turned darker. She began to study them, not just their work habits, but their personal lives, their routines, their vulnerabilities. Layla's sharp mind, once dedicated to perfecting ad campaigns, shifted its focus to something far more sinister. She started keeping a notebook, filling its pages with observations. Christine always took her coffee black and left her desk unattended for exactly 10 minutes every morning. Mark, the office tech guy, never locked his phone, leaving it on his desk during lunch breaks. Laura, the bubbly receptionist, liked to stay late to flirt with the security guard. The notebook became an obsession, a place where Layla's anger found purpose. She began to think of them not as people, but as obstacles, problems to be solved. Her thoughts spiraled further as the days dragged on. She no longer felt helpless, no longer cared about earning their respect. Respect wasn't necessary. Fear would suffice. One morning, Layla arrived at the office early, her face impassive as she walked past the empty desks. In her bag, nestled between her laptop and a stack of papers, was a small vial of liquid she had ordered online. The label promised it was undetectable, tasteless, and deadly in small doses. As she sat at her desk, the hum of the office slowly building around her, she felt a strange calm settle over her. They thought she was a ghost, a shadow. They would learn soon enough that shadows could kill. It was supposed to be a normal day, just like any other. Layla Harris arrived at the office promptly at 8:30 a.m., her routine as precise as clockwork. She walked past her colleagues, offering polite but distant nods, and sat down at her desk, the familiar weight of the workday pressing against her shoulders. But the air felt different that morning, thicker, charged with an unspoken tension that seemed to coil around her like a serpent. The whispers began almost immediately. Layla couldn't help but notice the way her coworkers glanced at her, their eyes flicking away whenever she met their gazes. It wasn't unusual, she was used to being an outsider. But today the looks lingered longer, the whispers sharper, laced with malice. By mid-morning, the tension snapped into something tangible. Layla was heading to the break room to refill her coffee when she heard her name. She stopped just outside the doorway, her heart skipping a beat as she caught the unmistakable cadence of Christine's voice. "I'm telling you, she's a liability," Christine said, her tone dripping with derision. "She just sits there like a damn statue. Do you think she even does anything?" A chuckle rippled through the room. Layla pressed herself against the wall, her hands gripping her mug so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Come on, Christine," another voice chimed in. It was Laura, the receptionist. "She's harmless. Weird, sure, but harmless." "Harmless," Christine scoffed. "You saw the numbers on that last campaign. She nearly tanked us. I had to stay late fixing her mess. Do you know how many clients we could have lost?" Layla's breath caught in her throat. It was a lie, all of it. She had worked tirelessly on that campaign, triple-checking every detail. The only reason there had been any errors was because Christine had ignored her emails flagging issues. "She's like one of those freaks you see on the news," another voice said. Mark, the tech guy. His tone was low, conspiratorial. "You know, the quiet ones who snap and go postal. I wouldn't be surprised if she had a knife in her desk or something." The laughter that followed was like nails on a chalkboard, grating and cruel. Layla felt something inside her crack, a fragile dam struggling to hold back a flood of anger and humiliation. She forced herself to keep walking, her footsteps as steady as she could manage, though her vision blurred with unshed tears. Back at her desk, she sat down and stared at her computer screen, the words on the document in front of her swimming into incoherence. Her hands trembled as she placed her mug down, careful not to spill the coffee that now tasted bitter on her tongue. The hours crawled by, each second dragging her deeper into her own thoughts. The humiliation of the break room encounter replayed in her mind on an endless loop, each laugh and insult carving fresh wounds into her psyche. By lunchtime, she could barely keep up the facade of calm, but it wasn't over yet. Layla returned to her desk after a brief trip to the restroom, only to find a crowd gathered around her workstation. Christine was standing at the center of it, holding up a printed document with a triumphant smirk. "This," Christine said, waving the paper for everyone to see, "is why we need to be more careful about who we hire." Layla, care to explain why half the figures in this report are completely wrong? Layla froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't seen that document before, hadn't even been assigned to that project. But before she could speak, Christine turned to the crowd, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "She's probably too busy daydreaming to do her job," Christine said, her words punctuated by laughter from the others. "Honestly, it's embarrassing." Layla tried to protest, her voice trembling as she said, "That's not my work. I didn't." "Enough," Layla, Christine snapped, cutting her off. "We don't have time for excuses. Just fix it, or I'll have to escalate this to HR." The crowd dispersed, leaving Layla standing alone at her desk, her face burning with a mixture of rage and shame. She wanted to scream, to cry, to make them see how wrong they were. But instead, she sat down, her hands balled into fists, and stared at the computer screen until her vision blurred. That night, as the office emptied and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence, Layla stayed behind, unable to move. Her thoughts churned like a storm, each insult and humiliation replaying in her mind with agonizing clarity. She thought about Christine, about the smug smile on her face and the cruel edge to her voice. She thought about Mark and Laura, about their laughter and their whispered conspiracies. Her eyes drifted to Christine's desk, where a folder sat, slightly askew. Without thinking, Layla stood and walked over to it. She flipped it open and felt her breath hitch. Inside were printed emails, spreadsheets, and meeting notes, all falsified, all designed to paint her as incompetent and unreliable. The sheer effort that had gone into framing her was staggering. Something inside her snapped. The dam holding back her anger shattered, and a dark, icy calm washed over her. She felt weightless, untethered from the emotions that had plagued her all day. In their place was a single, clear thought: they had to pay. As she stood there, staring down at the evidence of their betrayal, Layla felt a strange sense of clarity. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she closed the folder, placed it back exactly as she had found it, and returned to her desk. She opened her notebook, the one she had been keeping for weeks, and began to write. Her handwriting was steady, deliberate. As she detailed everything she had overheard, everything she had seen, she listed their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. By the time she finished, the office was dark and silent, the only sound the distant hum of traffic outside. Layla closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag. She walked out of the office that night with a calm she hadn't felt in years. She knew what she had to do, and for the first time she felt powerful. They thought they could break her. They thought she was weak, but they would learn the truth soon enough. The plan didn't come to Layla all at once. It unfolded over days, growing like a shadow in the corners of her mind. The humiliation and betrayal she'd endured at the hands of her colleagues had taken root in her thoughts, and now those thoughts had crystallized into something dark and unrelenting. It wasn't enough for them to feel the sting of regret. Layla wanted them to understand her pain, to feel it in their final moments. And so she began to plan. Each night after work, Layla sat at her small kitchen table under the dim glow of a single bulb, her notebook open before her. The pages were filled with scrawled observations and details about her coworkers, written with the precision of an engineer drafting blueprints. Christine liked her coffee black, with 2 sugars. She always left her office unattended when she went to the break room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Laura, the receptionist, stayed late on Thursdays, chatting with the security guard while she flirted her way into extra favors. Mark, the IT, never locked his phone and had a bad habit of eating at his desk, crumbs often littering his keyboard. Layla didn't just observe, she probed. She began asking seemingly innocent questions, her voice soft and unassuming. "What's your favorite snack, Laura?" she'd ask, her tone friendly enough to disarm suspicion. "Mark, do you ever worry about those energy drinks? I heard they're terrible for your heart." She listened carefully to every reply, her mind cataloging the information. It wasn't just their habits she noted, but their weaknesses, the small cracks in their lives that she could exploit. The poison was the first step. Layla spent hours on obscure forums, researching substances that could kill without leaving a trace. She learned about chemicals that mimicked heart attacks, ones that dissipated quickly in the bloodstream, leaving coroners baffled. When she finally made her decision, she ordered it under a pseudonym, having it shipped to a post office box she'd rented in a neighboring town. The vial arrived a week later, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, its contents clear and unassuming. The thought of holding something so potent, so deadly, sent a thrill through her. It was power distilled, the answer to all her helplessness. She kept the vial hidden in a hollowed-out book on her shelf, far from prying eyes. Every time she looked at it, she felt the same cold sense of purpose settle over her. But poison alone wouldn't be enough. Layla knew she needed to cover her tracks, to make each death seem unrelated. A string of obvious murders would point straight to her, and she couldn't afford to make mistakes. She began devising ways to disguise her intentions, to weave accidents and natural causes into her narrative. Christine was first. Layla loathed her more than any of the others, her smug superiority and sharp tongue the embodiment of everything that had pushed her to this point. She decided Christine's coffee would be the perfect vehicle for the poison poetic, in a way since it was the same coffee Christine always drank while berating her in meetings. The opportunity came one Friday morning. Christine was late, as usual, leaving her office door ajar as she hurried to the break room for her caffeine fix. Layla slipped inside, her movements precise and practiced. She opened Christine's desk drawer and retrieved the coffee tin she kept there, her hands steady as she measured out a spoonful of powder and mixed it with the poison. By the time Christine returned, her coffee was brewed and waiting, innocent and steaming on her desk. As Christine sipped her coffee during the morning meeting, Layla watched from her seat, her face carefully composed. She felt no guilt, no hesitation, only a grim satisfaction as Christine began to cough, her face flushing an unnatural shade of red. By the time the ambulance arrived, Christine was slumped in her chair, her coffee cup shattered on the floor beside her. The paramedics declared it a sudden heart attack, nothing unusual for someone with Christine's high-stress lifestyle. The office was in chaos for days after Christine's death, the mood somber and uneasy. Layla played her role perfectly, expressing just enough shock and sadness to avoid suspicion, but inside she was already thinking ahead. 1 down, 4 to go. Mark was next. Layla knew his routine better than he did, always at his desk, always eating some greasy fast food or chugging energy drinks to keep himself awake. She decided to tamper with his food, knowing it would be dismissed as food poisoning or an allergic reaction. The opportunity came on a rainy Tuesday. Mark left his desk to take a call, leaving his half-eaten burger sitting unattended. Layla moved quickly, pulling a small syringe from her bag. She injected the poison into the burger, the needle puncturing the bun with barely a trace. By the time Mark returned, the deed was done. He collapsed an hour later, clutching his stomach and gasping for air. The paramedics arrived, but it was too late. "Looks like an allergic reaction," one of them said, shaking his head. Poor guy didn't stand a chance. The deaths began to take their toll on the office. People whispered about bad luck, about the stress of their work environment. No one suspected foul play. Layla took careful note of every conversation, adjusting her plans as needed. Laura's death was the most satisfying. Layla had always hated her chipper demeanor, her ability to charm everyone around her. She decided to stage an accident, something dramatic that would leave no room for suspicion. Late one Thursday evening, when Laura stayed behind to flirt with the security guard, Layla followed her to the stairwell. She waited until Laura was distracted, her laughter echoing off the walls, before stepping out of the shadows. The look of surprise on Laura's face was brief, replaced by terror as Layla shoved her with all her strength. Laura tumbled down the stairs, her body hitting the concrete with sickening thuds. The security guard found her minutes later, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. "Must have slipped," he said, shaking his head. "These stairs are a death trap." By the time Layla was done, 5 of her colleagues were dead, each in ways that seemed unrelated, random. The office was gripped by fear and confusion, but no one suspected Layla. She was the quiet one, the ghost. Who would ever believe she was capable of such things? And yet, as Layla sat at her desk, watching the chaos unfold around her, she felt no remorse. They had pushed her to the edge, and she had simply pushed back. The morning Christine died, the office felt strangely calm, as though the storm brewing in Layla's mind had somehow settled the atmosphere around her. Layla arrived at her desk, placing her bag down with deliberate care, and glanced toward Christine's glass-walled office. It was empty, the leather chair behind the imposing desk still pushed out slightly from the previous day. She knew Christine would be in soon. The manager always arrived late, breezing in with an air of importance that made everyone else feel small. The poison was already mixed into Christine's coffee tin, waiting for the first scoop to dissolve into hot water. Layla had spent the previous night preparing for this moment, replaying it in her mind until every step felt inevitable. Her fingers itched with anticipation as she opened her email, pretending to type while she watched the clock tick toward 9:15, the time Christine usually made her coffee. When the door finally swung open, Layla didn't even look up. She heard Christine's sharp heels clicking against the floor, her clipped greeting to the receptionist, and the faint rustle of papers as she dumped her bag on her desk. Layla kept her head down, her hands steady as she typed an email she wasn't even reading. Christine's footsteps faded toward the break room, and Layla knew the plan was in motion. Minutes later, Christine reappeared with a steaming mug in hand. Layla felt her pulse quicken as she watched her boss settle into her chair, taking the first sip of coffee with a satisfied sigh. The meeting started shortly after, everyone gathering in the conference room as Christine led the discussion with her usual blend of authority and disdain. Layla sat near the back, her face a mask of polite attention as she waited. The first sign came 20 minutes in. Christine faltered mid-sentence, her hand clutching at her throat as she cleared it awkwardly. "Excuse me," she muttered, her voice hoarse. She took another sip of coffee, then coughed, the sound wet and deep. "Are you okay?" Laura asked, her brow furrowing in concern. Christine waved her off, her expression tight. "I'm fine," she snapped, though her voice wavered. Layla watched as Christine's face turned red, her breathing labored. She clutched at her chest, her eyes wide with panic. The room erupted into chaos, people rushing to her side, shouting for someone to call 911. Layla stayed in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched Christine collapse to the floor. By the time the paramedics arrived, Christine was gone. "Heart attack," one of them said after a cursory examination. "Happens more often than you'd think, especially in high-stress jobs like this." The office was shaken but quick to move on. By the end of the week, Christine's desk had been cleared out, her name removed from the office directory. Layla felt a strange sense of satisfaction as she walked past the empty office, knowing it had been her hand that silenced Christine's cruelty forever. But there were still others. Layla's satisfaction was short-lived, replaced by the gnawing need to complete what she had started. Mark was next. Layla hated the way he always seemed to hover near her desk, making snide comments under his breath or accidentally knocking her things to the floor. She had chosen his method of death carefully, ensuring it would look as mundane as possible. Mark's death was set in motion during lunch. He had a habit of ordering greasy takeout, leaving the bags strewn across his desk as he worked through his meal. Layla waited until he left to take a phone call, then slipped the poison-laced syringe from her bag. She injected it into the half-eaten burger, her movements swift and practiced. When Mark returned, she was back at her desk, her face serene as she typed away. He bit into the burger without a second thought, oblivious to the lethal dose that was now coursing through his system. It didn't take long. An hour later, Mark began to complain of stomach pains, his face pale and sweaty. "Must have been something I ate," he muttered, clutching his abdomen. His condition worsened rapidly, and soon he was doubled over, gasping for breath. The paramedics arrived again, their expressions grim as they loaded Mark onto a stretcher. "Looks like severe food poisoning," one said. "Could have been an allergy or bad meat." Layla listened to the murmurs of her coworkers as they speculated about Mark's death. No one mentioned foul play. No one looked at her twice. Laura's turn came soon after. Layla despised her cheery demeanor, the way she seemed to glide through life without consequence. Laura's death needed to be different, something that would shake the office to its core. Late one Thursday evening, Layla followed Laura to the stairwell. Laura had stayed late, as she often did, chatting with the security guard and laughing at his jokes. Layla waited in the shadows until Laura was alone, her heels clicking against the concrete steps as she headed down to the lobby. Layla moved quickly, her footsteps silent as she closed the distance. Laura didn't even have time to scream. Layla shoved her with all her strength, watching as Laura's body tumbled down the stairs, the sound of bone hitting concrete echoing through the empty stairwell. The security guard found her minutes later, her lifeless body crumpled at the bottom of the stairs. "Must have slipped," he said, shaking his head. "Poor girl." Each death brought Layla closer to her goal, the office growing quieter and more fearful with each passing week. Her coworkers avoided each other, their whispers laced with paranoia. Layla played her part perfectly, offering condolences and feigning shock at the tragedies that seemed to plague their small office. But inside she felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse, only the cold satisfaction of justice served. They had pushed her to the edge, and now they were paying the price. One by one they would all fall, their lives extinguished by the shadow they had underestimated. By the time Layla finished, the office was a hollow shell of what it once was, and she stood in the center of it, calm and untouchable, the architect of it all. The first death, Christine's, had been written off as a tragic but natural event, a heart attack, brought on by the relentless stress of her managerial role. Mark's sudden collapse was deemed a freak accident of food poisoning, while Laura's fatal fall was brushed aside as an unfortunate slip in the poorly lit stairwell. Each incident seemed isolated, unrelated, nothing more than an unfortunate streak of bad luck. But when the fourth and fifth deaths followed in quick succession, the whispers in the office turned into murmurs of fear, and fear turned into suspicion. The local police department initially approached the cluster of deaths with skepticism. While it was unusual for so many people from the same small company to die in such a short span of time, there was no clear evidence of foul play. It wasn't until the department's detective unit received a formal request from the company's legal counsel to investigate potential workplace sabotage that the case landed on the desk of Detective Michael Garrison. He was a methodical man, known for his sharp eye and unrelenting pursuit of the truth. When he first reviewed the file, he couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Garrison arrived at the office on a gray Monday morning, the sky outside mirroring the somber atmosphere within the building. Employees clustered in small groups, their voices hushed, their eyes darting nervously as the detective introduced himself to the office manager. Layla watched from her desk, her expression carefully neutral. She had anticipated this moment, prepared herself for the possibility of scrutiny. She had taken every precaution to ensure her tracks were covered, her methods untraceable. But as Garrison began his investigation, Layla felt a faint flicker of unease, a sensation she hadn't experienced since the first death. The detective began with interviews, speaking to each employee one by one. He asked about their relationships with the deceased, their routines, any unusual occurrences they might have noticed in the days leading up to the deaths. Most of the responses were vague, tinged with fear and confusion. Layla played her part perfectly, offering just enough detail to appear cooperative while keeping her answers deliberately unremarkable. "It's been hard," she said, her voice soft, her hands folded in her lap. "We were all so close, like a family. I can't imagine why this is happening." Garrison studied her carefully, his sharp eyes lingering on her for a beat longer than she liked. But he moved on, jotting down notes in his leather-bound notebook before turning his attention to the next employee. While the interviews yielded little of substance, Garrison's instincts told him there was more to the story. He requested access to the building's security footage, poring over hours of grainy recordings in search of patterns, anomalies, anything that might point to a motive or a suspect. It was during this painstaking review that he noticed something curious. Layla. She appeared in several key moments, always just outside the periphery of the incidents. In one clip, she exited the break room shortly before Christine's collapse. In another, she was seen walking down the hall past Mark's desk moments before he began to show symptoms. And in the stairwell camera feed, Garrison caught a fleeting glimpse of Layla entering the stairwell not long before Laura's fatal fall. It wasn't damning evidence, but it was enough to make her a person of interest. Garrison began to dig deeper, requesting access to Layla's personnel file. He noted her quiet demeanor, her lack of social connections within the office, the way her colleagues described her as invisible. The more he learned, the more he felt he was circling something significant. Layla, meanwhile, had no idea how close the detective was getting. She continued her routine, her outward calm unshaken, though she kept a closer eye on Garrison whenever he was in the office. She noticed the way he lingered near her desk, the way his gaze seemed to follow her movements. It was unnerving. But she reminded herself that she had been meticulous. There was nothing to tie her to the deaths, no fingerprints, no witnesses, no evidence. But then she made a mistake. It was small, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch Garrison's attention. One evening, as he reviewed the office's visitor logs, he noticed a discrepancy. Layla had signed out of the building at 5:30 p.m. on the night of Laura's death, but the security footage showed her leaving nearly an hour later. Curious, Garrison requested a search of Layla's desk. What he found was the first thread that began to unravel the web she had so carefully constructed. Tucked beneath a stack of innocuous files was a receipt from an online supplier of chemical agents. The purchase was dated weeks before the first death. The item description vague enough to raise suspicion but not definitive. Garrison's pulse quickened as he examined the receipt. the faint impression of a signature matching Layla's handwriting. It was the first concrete link, and he knew he needed more. Armed with this lead, Garrison obtained a warrant to search Layla's apartment. What he found there left no doubt in his mind about her guilt. Hidden inside a hollowed-out book on a dusty shelf was the vial of poison, nearly empty, alongside her notebook. The notebook was chilling in its detail, each page filled with observations about her co-workers, their habits, their routines, their weaknesses. It was a blueprint for murder, laid out with meticulous precision. When Layla arrived home that evening, she found Garrison waiting for her. He didn't need to say anything, the look on his face said it all. She didn't resist as he placed the handcuffs around her wrists, her expression a mask of eerie calm. During the interrogation, Garrison pushed her, demanding to know why she had done it. For hours, she remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. But finally she leaned forward, her eyes cold and unflinching. "They deserved it," she said simply. "Every single one of them." Her confession sent shockwaves through the community. The story splashed across headlines as the horrifying details of her crimes came to light. But even as she sat in her prison cell, awaiting trial, Layla felt no remorse. In her mind, she had delivered justice to those who had wronged her. And in the eerie silence of her isolation, she found a grim satisfaction in the knowledge that she had been the architect of their downfall. The trial of Layla Harris began on a stormy morning, the sky outside the courthouse a swirling mess of gray and black. Inside the packed courtroom, the air buzzed with a mix of tension and morbid fascination. The media had latched onto the story with a ravenous hunger, dubbing Layla the Office Reaper. Every detail of her crimes had been dissected in the news. But the public couldn't seem to get enough of the young woman who had transformed from a quiet office worker into a cold-blooded killer. Layla sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. To the jury, she looked unassuming, even frail, but her presence carried an unnerving weight. She didn't flinch as the prosecutor presented the evidence against her: the vial of poison, the damning notebook, the receipts, and the security footage that had placed her at the scene of each crime. As the prosecutor described each murder in vivid detail, the gallery shifted uncomfortably, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Christine's agonizing collapse during a meeting. Mark's slow, painful poisoning. Laura's broken body crumpled at the base of the stairwell. The jury avoided Layla's gaze as the evidence piled up, but she never looked away. The defense painted a different picture of Layla, one of a fragile young woman pushed to the brink by years of bullying and neglect. Her attorney argued that she had been a victim first, her actions the result of deep psychological trauma. Layla listened to this portrayal with detached curiosity, as though the person being described was someone she didn't recognize. The media outside the courthouse erupted into debates over her motives. Some called her a monster, others a tragic figure. Activists latched onto her story, pointing to the toxic workplace culture that had fueled her rage. The company itself came under fire, its remaining employees interviewed on live television. Each spoke in hushed tones about the suffocating atmosphere that had permeated the office before the murders. "She was always so quiet," one co-worker said, her voice trembling. "I never thought she was capable of something like this. But maybe we should have seen the signs." As the trial stretched on, Layla's name became a symbol, her actions dissected in think pieces and documentaries. Psychologists weighed in on her mental state, debating whether she was a calculated predator or a broken soul seeking retribution. For Layla, it was all just noise. Her fate was sealed when the prosecution introduced the notebook into evidence. The prosecutor held it up for the jury to see, the pages filled with meticulous details about her victims. "This," he said, his voice ringing through the courtroom, "is not the work of someone acting out of desperation. This is cold, calculated premeditation." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, Layla didn't react. She stood as the judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, her face as calm as it had been throughout the trial. But the story didn't end there. In the weeks that followed her sentencing, Layla became an enigma. Letters poured into the prison, some from admirers who saw her as a dark avenger, others from psychologists hoping to unravel the mind behind the murders. Layla ignored most of them, her days slipping into a quiet routine that mirrored the life she had once led in the office. Her former co-workers struggled to move on. The company underwent a massive restructuring, its leadership replaced in an effort to distance itself from the scandal. Counseling sessions were offered to employees, but many chose to leave, unable to bear the weight of what had happened. Laura's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the company, claiming that its toxic culture had created the perfect environment for tragedy. Christine's sister gave tearful interviews, describing the loss of a woman who had been driven and ambitious, not cruel as the defense had painted her. As for the office itself, it became a ghost town. The desks once occupied by the dead remained untouched, their belongings boxed up and forgotten in a storage room. Employees avoided the break room where Christine had taken her last sip of coffee, and the stairwell where Laura had fallen remained cordoned off, a silent reminder of the horrors that had unfolded there. Layla's story continued to haunt the public imagination. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to her case, their hosts speculating about her motives and debating whether justice had truly been served. A best-selling author announced plans to write a book, promising an unflinching look at the woman behind the murders. Inside her cell, Layla remained silent. She spoke only when necessary, her demeanor unnerving even to the guards who watched over her. Some claimed she spent hours staring at the walls, her eyes unblinking, as though replaying the events in her mind. Others whispered that she kept a new notebook, its contents a mystery. The prison psychologist assigned to her case attempted to break through her icy exterior, probing into her childhood, her time at the company, her thoughts about the murders. But Layla gave little away, her answers vague and detached. "Do you regret what you did?" the psychologist asked during one session, her pen poised over her notepad. Layla tilted her head slightly, her gaze distant. "Regret," she said slowly, "is for people who didn't know what they were doing." The psychologist's pen hovered in midair, the silence between them thick and heavy. Outside the prison walls, the world moved on, but Layla's name remained a haunting echo. For the families of the victims, closure seemed impossible, their grief compounded by the public fascination with the woman who had stolen their loved ones. For Layla, however, there was no sense of triumph, no lingering satisfaction. There was only the quiet, endless stretch of time, each day blending into the next. And yet, in the darkness of her cell, Layla felt something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't remorse, nor was it pride. It was simply the weight of what she had done, a shadow that would follow her until the end.